It began long before the Armada gathered, long before boots hit sand, long before the world heard the word overlord. It began in the quiet, in the uneasy stillness, after years of retreat, occupation, and loss. A moment when the Allies understood a single truth. They could not wait any longer. Europe was dying under the weight of tyranny. Every month, every week, every day, the continent remained in chains, the cost grew. The question was no longer whether they would strike, it was where, and when, and how. The decision demanded something the world had never seen. Not just an invasion, not just a military operation, but a resurrection of hope on a scale almost unimaginable. A force that would cross an ocean of fear and tear open a continent held by iron. A plan so vast and so complex that failure would not simply be defeat, it would be catastrophe. Inside dim British war rooms, lit by lamps that flickered over maps, stretching wall to wall, a handful of commanders wrestled with the impossible. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Ramsey, Lee Mallory, and a council of minds from across the free world. They spoke in hushed tones. They argued. They doubted. They returned to the same brutal truth. The only way to free Europe was to gamble everything on a single blow. And so Operation Overlord was born. Not from confidence, not from certainty, but from necessity. It began with an idea that the Allies could coordinate land, air, sea, deception, logistics, and resistance networks across entire nations in one synchronized strike. That they could move men from England, supplies from America, intelligence from spies scattered across Europe, and resistance acts from the shadows of occupied France. That all these moving parts, thousands upon thousands upon thousands, could align for one morning. It sounded like madness. It nearly was. Overlord was not a single operation. It was a storm woven from countless storms. The training alone consumed months that felt like years. Camps sprang up across Britain until the countryside became a maze of uniforms and accents. Convoys rumbled along muddy roads. Airfields roared with aircraft that never slept. Engineers built ports that would float, bombs that would listen, tanks that could swim, and obstacles the Germans would never anticipate. Scientists calculated tides down to the hour. Meteorologists tracked storms across the Atlantic with the pressure of history crushing their shoulders. Every soldier knew pieces, none knew the whole. Only the commanders carried the full weight, the knowledge that Overlord would decide the course of the war, and perhaps the fate of the world. The enemy watched the channel with suspicion, but not even they understood what was coming. Their intelligence failed to see the scale. Their leadership underestimated the will. Their defences stretched across thousands of miles, but even concrete and steel could not prepare them for the force gathering just beyond the horizon. As the date approached, tension thickened the air across every Allied base. Eisenhower hardly slept. Montgomery refined plans until dawn. Commanders walked among their men, not to boost morale, but to absorb it, to see the faces of those whose lives they were about to risk in a gamble that could collapse everything. Then came the weather. The channel turned violent. Wind hammered the coast. Waves rose like walls. The invasion teetered on the edge of cancellation. A single wrong call could doom hundreds of thousands. Eisenhower stood before his staff as storm maps covered the room like scars carved in ink. Meteorologists whispered that a brief window might open, not perfect, but possible. A moment where the seas might quiet just enough, the wind might ease just enough, the clouds might break just enough. Enough. That was all they needed. In the early hours before dawn, Eisenhower made the kind of decision history never forgets. A simple phrase, calm but carrying the weight of generations. Okay, let's go. In that moment, Overlord ceased to be a plan. It became destiny. Airborne divisions prepared to drop deep behind enemy lines. Sailors stood at their stations as engines thundered through the dark sea. Soldiers climbed aboard landing craft that smelled of salt, oil, and fear. Resistance fighters across France waited for coded messages whispering from radios hidden in drawers and barns. Fighter squadrons checked their fuel, knowing some would never return. The free world was about to collide with an empire built on terror. The invasion had not yet begun, but history had already changed course. Tonight, We return to the minds of the men who planned it, to the rooms where Overlord took shape, to the decisions that carved the path toward liberation. We return to the sleepless nights, the doubts, the risks, the moments where every breath carried the weight of millions. Before we begin, tell me, in words, where you are tuning in from tonight and what hour it is for you as we step into the world of Allied Command. Are you somewhere quiet and safe, or can you almost feel that tension in the air, that cold pre-dawn breeze that once carried the fate of Europe across the sea? And if these deep journeys into the past speak to you, help you think, help you drift, help you reflect, consider subscribing. January 24th, 1943. The Anfa Hotel, Casablanca. Two men sit in white wicker chairs under Moroccan sun, facing a cluster of journalists who have no idea they're about to witness history pivot on two words. Franklin Roosevelt leans forward, cigarette holder tilted at that familiar angle, and says almost casually, "Unconditional surrender." Winston Churchill's face freezes for just a fraction of a second. They hadn't agreed on this phrasing. The words are now out there, binding the Allied powers to total victory, to fighting until the Nazi regime ceases to exist. Behind the confident smiles for the cameras, both men understand, and what this means. There will be no negotiated peace, no compromise, no way out except through the beaches of Fortress Europe. And at this moment, in January 1943, they have no concrete plan for how to get there. The conference at Casablanca was supposed to coordinate Mediterranean strategy, to discuss North Africa and Sicily, to manage the delicate alliance with Stalin's Soviet Union. Instead, it became the birthplace of an impossible promise. Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky had arrived with maps, with urgent appeals, with the weight of millions dying on the Eastern Front. He spread those maps across the conference table and showed the stark reality: 157 German divisions crushing Soviet lines, while only 6 sat in occupied France. Stalin had been demanding a second front since 1941, watching his people die in numbers that made Western casualties seem like rounding errors. Now Maisky pressed the point again. When would the Americans and British actually invade Western Europe and force Hitler to divide his armies? Roosevelt and Churchill looked at each other across those maps and made a commitment that military reality couldn't yet support. They promised an invasion of France in 1944. The problem was simple and terrifying. No one in that room knew if it was actually possible. The combined chiefs of staff, the senior military commanders of America and Britain, had notebooks full of blank pages where the invasion plan should be. They had studied the French coast. They knew about the Atlantic Wall that Hitler was building, concrete and steel fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain, and they had all seen the reconnaissance photos from Dieppe. August 19th, 1942. A raid, they called it, almost an experiment. What happens when you try to seize a defended French port? The answer came in blood and wreckage. 6,086 men launched from England, mostly Canadians, told they'd practice for the real invasion someday. 9 hours later, 3,623 of them were casualties, dead or wounded or captured. 60%. The beaches had been a slaughter, tanks trapped on the shingle, men cut down in the water, and Dieppe was just one port, one beach, one division. How do you scale that up to an entire army, an entire coastline, against an enemy who now knows you're coming? Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan watched the Dieppe newsreels in a London screening room and felt the weight of what was about to land on his shoulders. In March 1943, he received orders to create Cossack, the Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander Organization. The title was intentionally awkward because it described an absurdity. Morgan was supposed to be the Chief of Staff for a Supreme Commander who hadn't been chosen yet, planning an invasion that hadn't been authorized for a date that hadn't been set, with resources that didn't exist. He was given an office in Norfolk House, 40 staff officers, and a mandate to solve an equation that had already killed thousands at Dieppe. Morgan was 50 years old, a logistics expert, not a glory seeker. He looked like a bank manager, methodical and precise. But he understood something crucial. Before anyone could storm Hitler's Europe, someone had to turn that political promise in Casablanca into actual numbers, actual ships, actual plans that might not get every man killed. The 40 officers of Cossack began their work in spring 1943 with the basic question, where? The French coast stretched over 3,000 miles. German radar covered almost all of it. The Atlantic wall was growing stronger every month. Rommel himself now appointed to inspect and reinforce it. Morgan's team spread maps across massive tables, measuring distances with string and compasses like medieval navigators. They listed requirements: beaches with the right gradient, so tanks wouldn't get stuck; proximity to England, so fighter aircraft could provide cover; distance from heavily fortified ports, since Dieppe proved you couldn't take one by frontal assault. Every requirement eliminated options. Past to Calais, the obvious choice. The narrowest point of the channel, too obvious. The Germans expected it, had fortified it with their best troops and heaviest guns. Brittany, with its deep water ports, too far from British airfields. The fighters could only fly so far, stay for so many minutes, before they had to turn back. If the invasion happened beyond that protective umbrella, Luftwaffe bombers would own the sky. Morgan's real nightmare wasn't just where to land, it was what came after. Every military doctrine, every lesson from amphibious operations throughout history said the same thing: you must capture a major port within 24 hours or the invasion will fail. Armies don't run on courage and bullets alone. They need thousands of tons of supplies. Every single day. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement equipment. Ports have cranes, warehouses, railway connections, the infrastructure to handle that volume. But Dieppe had proved that taking a defended port was near suicidal, and even if you somehow captured one, the Germans would destroy it before retreating. They'd blow the docks, sink ships in the harbours, demolish the cranes and warehouses. Intelligence reports showed Hitler had given explicit orders: scorched earth for any port the Allies approached. So Morgan faced an impossible paradox. He needed a port to supply the invasion, but he couldn't count on capturing any port that could handle the required tonnage. The equation didn't balance. Something was fundamentally wrong with the assumptions. There was also the landing craft problem, which seemed almost mundane until you understood its implications. To land an army on hostile beaches, you need specialized ships: landing ship, tank, the LST, which could carry Sherman tanks right up to the beach and drop a ramp; landing craft, infantry, the LCI, for troops; smaller Higgins boats for the first assault waves. In January 1943, when Roosevelt and Churchill made their promise, the number of these craft available in Britain was functionally zero. The entire Allied production of landing craft was committed to two other theatres: MacArthur's island-hopping campaign across the Pacific and the planned invasions of Sicily and Italy in the Mediterranean. The U.S. was building them as fast as possible. Andrew Higgins in New Orleans had factories running 24-hour shifts, welding together the flat-bottomed boats that would become icons of the war. But construction took time, required steel and workers that were needed everywhere else, and the Pacific Theatre had first claim. The calculations were brutal. To land even 3 divisions on French beaches simultaneously, you'd need hundreds of LSTs. There were currently fewer than 90 in British waters. Morgan worked through the summer of 1943, refining the plan, eliminating the impossible options, moving pins on maps. His team calculated tide tables for every beach, studied the moon phases because paratroopers would need moonlight to jump behind enemy lines. They analysed German radar coverage, defensive positions, road networks for reinforcements to arrive. By autumn, Cossack had produced a thick document marked Most Secret that represented the best guess for how to actually invade France. 3 divisions landing on 3 beaches, somewhere in Normandy, with airborne troops dropping inland to block German counterattacks. It was labelled as a lodgement, military jargon for getting ashore and staying there long enough to build up strength. Not a breakthrough, not a rapid advance. Just survival, establishing a foothold that wouldn't be thrown back into the sea. The plan acknowledged they probably wouldn't capture Caen, the nearest significant city, on the first day. Probably wouldn't link all the beaches together for several days. Definitely wouldn't have a port. They'd have to supply everything over open beaches, hoping for good weather, knowing that one channel storm could cut them off from England and doom the entire force. Churchill read Morgan's plan and felt that familiar dread, the memories of Gallipoli in the First World War where he'd championed an amphibious landing that became a disaster. He'd pushed that operation, and it had killed over 50,000 men and stained his reputation for decades. Now they were proposing something far larger, far riskier. The Prime Minister gathered his chiefs of staff and asked the blunt question: Are we going to create another Gallipoli, but this time killing 100,000 young men? The room had no good answer. War is full of terrible choices. Stalin's armies were bleeding Germany white in the east, but they needed relief. The Nazi Empire had to be broken from two directions, or it might never be broken at all, and the political promise was now public, repeated in newspapers, broadcast on radio. The Second Front wasn't a contingency anymore. It was an obligation that held together the alliance with the Soviet Union. To back out now would be to potentially lose the war through disunion, letting Stalin make a separate peace with Hitler out of betrayal and exhaustion. As 1943 turned toward 1944, Morgan's plans sat on desks in Washington and London, waiting for the selection of a supreme commander who would actually lead this operation. The promise made in Casablanca had transformed into hundreds of pages of logistics, timetables, and projections. But everyone who read those pages understood the subtext written between every line. This might work, or it might be the greatest military catastrophe in history. The difference would come down to leadership, to weather, to luck, and to the courage of young men who'd be asked to step off landing craft into machine gun fire because two leaders in wicker chairs had promised the world that Hitler would be defeated unconditionally. No negotiation, no surrender. Just through the beaches. If they could find a way that didn't repeat Dieppe slaughter on a scale that would break armies and nations. The outline was ready. The promise was made. Now someone had to make it real. April 1943. Norfolk House, London. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan stands before a wall covered in maps, photographs, and overlapping layers of tracing paper marked with coloured pencil. His small team of Cossack planners surrounds a table that holds what might be the most complex jigsaw puzzle ever assembled, except every piece is a variable that can kill thousands of men if calculated wrong. They're trying to solve what Morgan privately calls the equation. How many divisions, on how many beaches, at what time of day, during which tide, under which moon phase, with how many ships, facing how many defenders, with what chance of survival. The equation has dozens of interdependent variables. Change one, and three others shift. Solve one problem, and three new ones appear. Morgan lights his pipe, studies the maps, and begins the systematic work of defining what's possible before someone else has to decide what's acceptable. The first variable is the most fundamental. Where on the 3,000 miles of French coastline can you actually land? Cossacks analysts begin eliminating options through a process of subtraction. Belgium and the Netherlands are too far north, require crossing estuaries that German forces could easily defend, and the approach would be visible from radar stations across a wide arc. The Brittany Peninsula has excellent ports like Brest and Saint-Nazaire, but it's over 200 miles from the British airfields that would provide fighter cover. RAF Spitfires and American Thunderbolts can fly about 200 miles, fight for maybe 15 minutes, and fly back before fuel runs dry. Anything beyond that range is a death sentence for the landing force. Luftwaffe bombers would arrive unopposed. That eliminates the western coast. The Pas de Calais, the Dover Strait, the obvious choice? Too obvious. German intelligence isn't stupid. They know it's the shortest channel crossing, just 21 miles of water. They've packed the coast with the 15th Army, their best divisions, and fortified every village into a strong point. Cossacks' estimates suggest an assault on Pas de Calais would face 3 times the defenders and 10 times the fortifications compared to other sectors. The math doesn't work. Attacking there would be like announcing your arrival 6 months in advance and then charging into the prepared kill zone. That leaves Normandy, and even calling it a choice feels generous. It's more like the last option standing after eliminating everywhere else. The Normandy coast runs about 50 miles between the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River, dotted with small towns: Saint, Mère-Église, Carentan, Bayeux, Caen. The beaches have codenames from previous reconnaissance: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. They're within range of British airfields, barely. They're defended by the German 716 Infantry Division, a static unit composed of overage soldiers and conscripts from occupied territories, Poles and Russians, pressed into service, not the elite SS or Panzer troops. The radar coverage is less dense here than at Calais. The terrain behind the beaches is difficult, farmland divided by hedgerows and small fields, which could slow any Allied advance but would also complicate German counterattacks. But Normandy has one fatal flaw that violates every rule of amphibious warfare. There's no major port. Cherbourg sits at the northern tip of the Carentan Peninsula, about 60 miles from the proposed landing beaches. Le Havre is 100 miles east. In between, nothing but small fishing, harbours that couldn't land supplies for a Boy Scout troop, much less an army. Morgan's team dives into technical specifications that would bore anyone who didn't understand they meant life or death. Beach gradient, the slope from waterline to high ground, has to fall within a narrow range. Too steep, and vehicles get stuck trying to climb out. Too shallow, and the tidal flat becomes hundreds of yards of exposed sand where men are easy targets. The sand itself matters. Consistency, compaction, whether it can support a Sherman tank weighing 30 tons or swallow it like quicksand. Coastal engineers analyse reconnaissance photographs with magnifying glasses, looking for rock outcroppings, patches of clay, anything that would trap vehicles. They study the tides because the English Channel has some of the most extreme tidal ranges in the world. At low tide, the beaches are wide and exposed. At high tide, the water reaches the seawall or cliff base, leaving no room for manoeuvre. The ideal moment is maybe 3 hours before high tide, when enough beach is exposed to landcraft, but not so much that men have to cross hundreds of yards under fire. Then there's the obstacle problem, and this is where German ingenuity turns the beach itself into a weapon. Reconnaissance photos from RAF overflights show the coast increasingly studded with obstacles: Belgian gates, steel frameworks, 10 feet tall designed to rip the bottom out of landing craft. Element C. Steel hedgehogs welded together at angles, invisible at high tide, waiting to gut any boat that hits them. Wooden stakes driven into the sand at 45-degree angles, topped with telemines, explosives that will detonate when a landing craft's ramp hits them. The obstacles are spaced in rows, creating a three-dimensional maze. German engineers are installing them at a pace that suggests they'll have over 500,000 in place by spring 1944. Cossacks' naval experts calculate that landing at high tide means hitting these obstacles when they're submerged and invisible. Landing at low tide means crossing exposed beaches, but dodging visible obstacles. There's a narrow window, perhaps 40 minutes, during the rising tide, when obstacles are visible, but the water is deep enough for craft to approach. Miss that window by 15 minutes either way, and casualties could double. The moon becomes another variable in Morgan's equation, and this one connects to a capability the British and Americans are still developing: large-scale airborne operations. The plan evolving on those Norfolk House tables requires paratroopers and glider infantry to land behind the beaches before the amphibious assault, seizing key bridges and road junctions, blocking German reinforcements from reaching the coast in those critical first hours. But paratroopers jumping from aircraft at night need moonlight to see drop zones, to find each other after landing, to distinguish friend from enemy in the darkness. Too much moon, and German anti-aircraft gunners can see the transport planes clearly. Too little moon, and paratroopers land scattered and disoriented, unable to complete their missions. The moon phase has to align with the tide requirement, 3 hours before high tide at dawn, with enough moonlight in the hours before for airborne operations. Cossacks astronomers calculate that this combination occurs only 3 days per month. In 1944, the windows fall in early May, early June, and early July. 3 days per month, 3 months of possibility, 9 days in the entire year when the invasion could happen. Weather forecasting becomes an obsession because the English Channel is notoriously treacherous. Spring brings storms that can whip the channel into 15-foot waves, making landing craft uncontrollable, turning soldiers into seasick masses before they even reach hostile fire. Cossack requests historical weather data for Normandy going back 50 years. They find that June typically offers the best conditions: longer daylight hours, slightly calmer seas, lower chance of the multi-day storms that shut down the channel completely. But typically and slightly are words that offer no comfort when you're planning to put 100,000 men on open water in flat-bottomed boats. The meteorologists attached to Cossack explain their limitations. Weather forecasting in 1943 is primitive by later standards, relying on observations from ships and coastal stations, with no satellites, no computer models, no way to see what's developing far out in the Atlantic until it's already approaching. They can give maybe 36 to 48 hours of reliable prediction. That means the invasion commander will have to make the final go or no-go decision with less than 2 days of weather visibility, gambling thousands of lives on whether a storm system will arrive earlier or later than projected. German defensive capabilities form another, layer of the equation, and this is where Morgan's optimism meets reality's hammer. The Atlantic Wall isn't just propaganda. Hitler has poured concrete and steel into coastal fortifications from Norway to Spain, creating thousands of bunkers, artillery positions, machine gun nests. In Normandy, the defences are lighter than at Pas-de-Calais, but they're not trivial. The 716 Infantry Division holds the coast, about 12,000 men spread across 50 miles, which sounds thin until you realise they're positioned in fortified positions with interlocking fields of fire. Behind them, within a day's march, sit more mobile divisions, the 21st Panzer Division near Caen, with over 100 tanks and experienced crews who fought in North Africa. The 12th SS Panzer Division, teenagers from the Hitler Youth, fanatical and well-trained, positioned to counterattack any landing. The German doctrine is clear. Let the Allies come ashore, then crush them on the beaches before they can dig in. Rommel, now appointed to command coastal defences, is touring Normandy in autumn 1943, demanding more obstacles, more mines, more strongpoints. He's seen what Allied air power and naval guns can do in North Africa. His counter-strategy is to make the beach itself so deadly that attackers never get past the waterline. Morgan's equation keeps expanding. Artillery range. German coastal guns can reach 15 miles out to sea, so the invasion fleet will be under fire from the moment they approach to the moment troops land. Naval gunfire support. How many battleships and cruisers will it take to suppress those German guns? And will the bombardment actually work against reinforced concrete bunkers? Air support. How many bombers to strike the defences before H-hour, and will they hit the right targets or just crater empty fields? Landing craft capacity. How many men and vehicles per wave? How long between waves? How many trips can each craft make before mechanical failure or enemy fire takes them out? Supply calculations. Each division needs approximately 600 tons of supplies per day, food and ammunition and fuel, all of which must come across open beaches since there's no port. Casualty estimates. Cossacks planners look at Diepp's 60% loss rate and try to project something better, but nobody really knows. 10% casualties might be optimistic. 20% is planning for difficulty. 30% is disaster. Anything above that, and you're not invading, you're committing massacre. By autumn 1943, Morgan's Cossack team has produced a plan that balances all these variables into something that might potentially work. 3 divisions landing on 3 beaches in Normandy. 1 American beach on the western flank, 2 British-Canadian beaches on the eastern flank. Airborne divisions dropping inland before dawn to secure exits and block counterattacks. A lodgement, they call it, not a breakthrough. Get ashore, link the beachheads, hold a perimeter, maybe 10 miles deep, and build up strength before attempting any breakout. The plan acknowledges brutal realities. They probably won't take Caen on D-Day as doctrine suggests they should. They definitely won't have a port, so everything depends on maintaining supply flow over open beaches, praying for calm weather. They'll need overwhelming air superiority, because without it, Luftwaffe attacks will shred the beaches. They'll need naval gunfire support beyond anything previously attempted in warfare. And they'll need more landing craft than currently exist in the European theatre, which means pulling resources from other operations, delaying other invasions, making enemies of other commanders who need those same ships. Morgan's equation has an answer. It's not a good answer, not a confident answer, but it's the only answer that doesn't start with, "This is impossible." The plan goes forward, stamped most secret, circulated to the combined chiefs of staff, waiting for the selection of a supreme commander who will inherit this equation and all its lethal variables. Morgan has defined what's possible. Someone else will have to decide if it's acceptable. June 1943, a cramped conference room in Norfolk House. Cossack planners surround a massive map of the French coast, coloured pins marking potential landing sites like a deadly game of strategy. Lieutenant General Morgan traces his finger along the Normandy shoreline, a 50-mile stretch between the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River, and says what everyone's thinking. Nobody wants this beach. It's not an ideal invasion site by any military doctrine. It's just the least terrible option remaining after systematically eliminating everywhere else. Pas-de-Calais is too fortified, too expected. Brittany is too distant from air cover. Belgium requires crossing rivers. under fire. That leaves Normandy a coast the Germans themselves consider unlikely for invasion because it lacks the one thing every amphibious assault requires, a major port within immediate striking distance. But Morgan's team is learning that modern war sometimes means choosing between impossible options and selecting the one that might kill slightly fewer men. The systematic elimination begins with Pas de Calais, and understanding why it's rejected reveals the chess game being played across the Channel. The Strait of Dover, the narrowest point between England and France, just 21 miles of water. From the White Cliffs, British observers can literally see France on clear days. It's the obvious choice, which makes it the wrong choice. German intelligence officers studying maps in Berlin reached the same conclusions as Allied planners. Shortest crossing, fastest reinforcement from England, quickest route to Germany through Belgium. The 15th German Army sits at Pas de Calais, Hitler's best-equipped force in the West, with over 200,000 men and the highest concentration of coastal fortifications anywhere on the Atlantic Wall. Every town is a fortress, every beach approach is sited by multiple artillery positions. The cliffs overlooking the landing areas provide perfect defensive positions. Cossack analysts estimate that an assault on Pas de Calais would face 3 defending divisions for every attacking division, a ratio that historically ends in bloody failure. Dieppe was bad. Pas de Calais would be Dieppe multiplied by 10. Moving west, the Cossack team examines Brittany with its deep water ports, Brest, Saint-Nazaire, Lorient. These are exactly the kind of ports military doctrine says you need, capable of handling massive cargo volumes, with infrastructure to support an army. But Brittany sits at the end of a peninsula over 250 miles from British airfields in southern England. RAF Spitfires and American P-47 Thunderbolts have combat radiuses around 200 miles, meaning they can fly that distance, fight for perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, and return before fuel runs out. Landing in Brittany means landing beyond the protective umbrella of Allied fighters. The Luftwaffe, even weakened by years of attrition, would have free rein over the beaches for hours every day. Junkers 88 bombers could strike landing craft in continuous waves. The naval fleet would be vulnerable. Troops on the beaches would be sitting targets. And even if you somehow secured Brittany, you'd be trapped at the end of a peninsula with the entire German army between you and Paris. It's a strategic dead end. That narrows the viable coastline to a 100-mile stretch between the Seine River and the Carentan Peninsula, the region called Normandy. The team subdivides this further based on those critical technical requirements: beach gradient, tidal range, proximity to airfields, distance from German strongpoints. The eastern sector, near the Seine, is too close to Le Havre, a heavily fortified port city with German naval units and coastal batteries. The western edge of the Carentan Peninsula has the wrong tidal conditions, and the beaches are overlooked by cliffs that would make them slaughter zones. That leaves the central Normandy coast, and even here, the choices are exercises in compromise. The beaches aren't ideal, they're just marginally less suicidal than alternatives. This is where the famous code names appear on the maps: Utah Beach on the eastern Cotentin coast, then moving east, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach near the Orne River. 5 beaches across 50 miles, though Morgan's initial plan in 1943 only considers using 3. The intelligence picture on Normandy slowly assembles through dangerous reconnaissance. Commando teams launch raids from submarines, swimming ashore at night to gather sand samples, measure beach gradients, photograph obstacles. Some of these men don't return, captured or killed by German. Patrols, RAF, reconnaissance aircraft, fly repeated sorties, photographing every mile of coastline, every German position, accepting losses to anti-aircraft fire. The photographic interpreters at RAF Medmenham examine thousands of images through stereoscopic viewers, noting every bunker, every trench line, every position that could hold machine guns. They count the obstacles being installed: Belgian gates, Element C steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes topped with mines. By autumn 1943, they estimate over 500,000 obstacles will be in place by spring. The images also reveal the terrain behind the beaches, and this is where an unpleasant surprise waits: the Bocage, Norman hedgerow country. Pre-war tourist maps show Normandy as pastoral farmland, gentle and rolling. The aerial photos reveal something different: a landscape divided into tiny fields by earthen banks, topped with dense hedgerows, some 8 feet tall with roots 4 feet deep, creating natural fortifications every 100 to 200 yards. This terrain isn't on any military planning maps. Nobody considered it relevant. That oversight will cost lives. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, German commanders are conducting their own evaluation of these same beaches, reaching conclusions that will prove catastrophic for their defence. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrives in France in October 1943, appointed by Hitler to inspect and reinforce coastal defences. Rommel fought the Allies in North Africa, experienced their overwhelming material superiority, their air power, their ability to coordinate naval gunfire with ground advances. He believes the invasion must be defeated on the beaches, in the first 24 hours before the Allies establish a foothold. Once ashore and dug in, he argues, they'll be impossible to dislodge. Rommel tours Normandy in late autumn, standing on these beaches, studying the terrain, and dictating assessments to his staff. His reports back to Berlin are revealing he considers Normandy an unlikely invasion site because of its distance from major ports. He believes the Allies will strike at Pas de Calais, accepting the heavier defences because doctrine requires port capture. Therefore, Normandy needs obstacles and mines, but not the elite troops or concentrated armour that Pas de Calais demands. This German assessment becomes an invisible advantage for Allied planners, though they won't fully understand it until after the war. The 716 Static Infantry Division holds the Normandy coast, approximately 12,000 men spread across 50 miles, which means roughly one defender per 15 feet of coastline if you could somehow space them evenly. But they're not evenly spaced. They're concentrated in strong points, at likely landing areas, which leaves gaps. The division itself is what the Germans call static, meaning it lacks trucks and vehicles for mobility. Many soldiers are over 35, considered too old for frontline service on the Eastern Front. The unit includes conscripts from occupied countries, Poles and Russians given German uniforms and minimal training, their loyalty questionable. The static divisions are equipped with captured French, Polish, and Czech weapons, a logistics nightmare with incompatible ammunition. Behind this coastal crust, the German armour sits further inland. 21st Panzer Division near Caen, about 10 miles from the coast. 12th SS Panzer Division farther back, positioned to respond to multiple possible landing sites. But there's a critical vulnerability in German doctrine. The Panzer Divisions can't move without authorization from High Command, and High Command means Hitler personally. Rommel wants them closer to the coast, wants authority to counterattack immediately. His superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, believes the panzers should stay inland, counterattack after the Allies commit to a landing site. This debate remains unresolved through spring 1944, creating command paralysis that will prove fatal. The final selection of Normandy happens almost by default, a process of elimination concluding with an exhale and a shrug. Morgan presents the recommendation to the combined chiefs of staff in summer 1943. Normandy, 3 beaches initially, expandable to 5 if resources permit, with airborne operations to secure the flanks and block German counterattacks. The chiefs approve not because it's a good plan, but because it's the only plan that might work. Churchill broods over the decision, remembering Gallipoli, imagining another disaster. Roosevelt trusts his military advisors but understands the political stakes. Stalin is demanding action, and the Second Front can't be delayed indefinitely without fracturing the alliance. The approval is tentative, conditional on finding a supreme commander, securing enough landing craft, achieving air superiority, and about 50 other prerequisites. But the destination is set, Normandy. The beach that neither side wants will become the most contested stretch of sand in human history. By autumn 1943, both sides are preparing for different battles. The Germans are strengthening Pas de Calais, convinced that's where the blow will fall, allocating their best divisions and heaviest fortifications to defend against an invasion they believe must come there. The Allies are planning for Normandy, accepting its disadvantages, knowing they'll have to solve the port problem, the supply problem, and the breakout problem after landing. Rommel is installing obstacles on Normandy beaches, but not as many as at Calais, not with the same urgency. The 15th Army at Calais gets priority for equipment and reinforcements. The 716 Division in Normandy gets orders to keep building obstacles and digging trenches with whatever resources remain. This misallocation will prove decisive, but in autumn 1943, nobody on either side understands that yet. They're both preparing for battles they think are coming, making assumptions based on doctrine and logic and what seems militarily sensible. War, as always, has its own plans. The beach that nobody wanted is about to become the hinge on which the war pivots, chosen not because it was ideal, but because everything else was worse. January 1st, 1944, Street James's Square, London. General Dwight David Eisenhower formally assumes command of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the organisation that will plan and execute the invasion of Western Europe. He's 53 years old, a career officer who'd never commanded troops in combat before, in 1942, but who possesses a talent that proves more valuable: the ability to manage egos, British and American, keeping fractious allies focused on common purpose. Eisenhower has spent the last year in the Mediterranean, coordinating the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, learning amphibious warfare through practical experience and costly mistakes. Now he sits at a desk in London, opening the Cossack plan that Lieutenant General Morgan's team has laboured over for 9 months, the blueprint marked Most Secret that represents the best thinking on how to invade France. He reads for several hours, making notes in the margins, his expression growing increasingly troubled. By evening, his assessment is complete and brutally simple. The plan won't work. The fundamental problem reveals itself immediately. The Cossack plan proposes landing 3 divisions on 3 beaches across 30 miles of coastline. Eisenhower's experience in Sicily and Italy taught him that amphibious assaults are vulnerable at the edges, where German counterattacks can compress the beachhead, cut off sectors, defeat the landing in detail by destroying isolated units. 3 divisions on 30 miles creates a thin crust, potentially brittle, definitely lacking the mass to absorb the inevitable German counteroffensive. Eisenhower knows what's waiting behind those Normandy beaches. The 21st Panzer Division near Caen, the 12th SS Panzer Division farther back, the Panzerlehr Division positioned to reinforce. That's at least 600 tanks, all within a day's march of the coast. German doctrine will throw these armoured units at the beachhead in coordinated counterattacks, attempting to split the landing forces before they can link up and dig in. 3 divisions can't generate enough combat power to stop 6 Panzer divisions simultaneously. The math is stark. Attackers need overwhelming local superiority in amphibious operations, at least 3-1, preferably 5-1. The Cossack plan offers rough parity, maybe worse. That's not an invasion. That's a slaughter waiting to happen. On January 3rd, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery arrives in London to take command of ground forces for the invasion, and he reaches the same conclusion after reading the plan. Montgomery is abrasive, arrogant, meticulous, a commander who thinks in terms of mass and preparation, who believes in never attacking until you've assembled overwhelming force. He opens his copy of the Cossack plan, reads for perhaps 30 minutes, and writes in red pencil across the cover page, "Not enough," underlined 3 times. His detailed critique fills margins with sharp observations. Frontage too narrow to deploy adequate force, reserve divisions too far from the action, airborne plan too timid, supply arrangements assume everything goes perfectly when nothing ever does. Montgomery sketches his own vision: 5 divisions on 5 beaches across 50 miles, American sector in the west, British and Canadian sector in the east, clear boundaries to prevent command confusion. Double the width, double the force, double the chance of success. It's audacious, it's expensive, and it requires resources that don't exist. The meeting between Eisenhower and Montgomery on January 7th, 1944, sets the course for everything that follows. They agree the Cossack plan is inadequate, a good starting point but not an executable operation. Eisenhower pulls out a notepad and begins calculating what 5 divisions actually means. Assault echelon, 5 infantry divisions, hitting the beaches in the first wave, approximately 60,000 men. Follow-up forces, another 5 divisions landing by end of D-Day, plus corps and army troops, combat engineers, anti-aircraft units, another 90,000 men. That's 150,000 men on one day, more than the entire Union Army at Gettysburg, all funneled through 5 beaches while under fire. The equipment multiplies the complexity: tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies. Every soldier needs approximately 40 pounds of supplies per day just to stay combat effective. Do the math. 150,000 men times 40 pounds equals £3 million, 1,500 tons, and that's just for the first day. Montgomery adds airborne forces to the calculation. 2 American divisions, 82nd and 101st Airborne, plus 1 British division, the 6th Airborne, all dropping behind the beaches in darkness before the amphibious assault. Now there are 8 divisions hitting simultaneously, and the landing craft requirements are exploding. The landing craft problem becomes the crisis that nearly kills the invasion before it launches. The Cossack plan, with its 3 divisions, required approximately 150 LSTs, landing ship tank, the large vessels that carry Sherman tanks, and heavy vehicles directly to the beach. Eisenhower's expanded plan needs at least 230 LSTs to land 5 divisions with adequate armour support. On January 1st, 1944, there are exactly 88 LSTs in British waters available for the invasion. The shortfall is catastrophic. 142 ships that don't exist, can't be built in time, and are desperately needed in other theatres. Admiral Alan Kirk, the naval commander, brings Eisenhower an inventory that reads like a logistics nightmare. 17 LSTs are in shipyards undergoing repair, unavailable until March. 30 LSTs are committed to operations in Italy and can't be withdrawn without collapsing the Italian campaign. The Pacific Theatre has over 160 LSTs, but Admiral King, commander of Pacific forces, refuses to transfer any, arguing that the island-hopping campaign against Japan requires every available ship. King and Eisenhower exchange increasingly heated cables, the Pacific commander at one point threatening resignation if pressured to give up his LSTs. Churchill becomes involved, and the political dimension complicates everything. The Prime Minister wants to continue the Italian campaign, pushing north toward the Po Valley, tying down German divisions that could otherwise reinforce France. This strategy requires maintaining large forces in Italy, which means keeping the Mediterranean LSTs right where they are. Eisenhower argues the opposite. The invasion of France is the decisive operation, the one that could win the war in Europe, and everything else should be subordinated to its success. That includes Italy, that includes the Pacific, that includes any other operation currently using landing craft. The debate rages through January and February, cables flying between London, Washington, and the Mediterranean. Operation Anvil, the planned invasion of southern France meant to support the main Normandy landing, becomes a bargaining chip. Cancelling Anvil would free 40 LSTs for Overlord. Churchill resists, not wanting to abandon the Mediterranean strategy. Roosevelt mediates, and finally, in March, Anvil is postponed indefinitely, its landing craft redirected to England. Every ship becomes precious, their movements tracked like gold shipments. The date becomes another casualty of the expanded plan. The Cossack proposal had targeted early May 1944, aiming for the first tide and moon window after winter storms typically subsided. Eisenhower's requirement for 5 divisions pushes that timeline back by 30 days minimum. The landing craft have to be transferred from the Mediterranean a week at sea. They need refitting for cold water operations, another 2 weeks. The troops and equipment have to be reorganised into new formations, trained for different beaches than they've been practicing for under the 3-beach plan, loaded onto different ships. The Utah Beach sector is a new addition, requiring entirely new planning, new maps, new reconnaissance. The airborne operations expand dramatically, requiring additional training for pathfinders who'll land first to mark drop zones, coordination between Air Force transport units and Army paratroopers, practice jumps to refine procedures. All of this takes time, pushing the invasion into June. The next suitable tide and moon combination after early May occurs June 5th through 7th, a 3-day window. That becomes the new target, early June, accepting the risk that weather might be worse than May, accepting that the delay gives Germans more time to strengthen defences, accepting everything because the alternative is launching an inadequate invasion that fails catastrophically. Montgomery begins reorganising the ground forces into the structure that will become famous. British Second Army under General Dempsey handling Gold, Juno and Sword beaches on the eastern flank. American First Army under General Bradley handling Utah and Omaha beaches on the western flank. Airborne troops assigned to secure both flanks. American divisions on the west to block approaches to Utah Beach and seize causeways through flooded areas. British division on the east to capture bridges over the Orne River and Caen Canal. This creates clear national sectors, reducing the potential for command confusion, ensuring British and American units aren't intermingled where communication difficulties could cause fratricidal fire. It's a sensible structure, but it reveals an underlying tension. Overlord is not one invasion, but two parallel invasions happening simultaneously under coordinated but separate command structures. Montgomery, commanding ground forces overall, will have to manage not just the battle but British and American sensibilities, ensuring that neither side feels subordinated, that credit is shared, that mistakes by one nationality don't poison the alliance. By late January, the revised plan exists in outline form, and Eisenhower presents it to the combined chiefs of staff in a tense meeting. The chiefs approve, reluctantly, recognizing they've spent too much political capital on the invasion promise to back out now. But the approval comes with stark warnings. The landing craft shortage means there's no margin for error, no reserve if ships are lost in training or to German attacks before D-Day. The expanded front means supply arrangements will be even more critical, the need for artificial harbours even more urgent. The delayed date means risking worse weather, and weather forecasting remains primitive, offering only 36 to 48 hours of reliable prediction. Eisenhower acknowledges all this, adds his own concerns about German defensive improvements during the delay, and concludes with a statement that becomes his operating principle. This operation is not being planned with any alternatives. This operation is planned as a victory, and that's the way it's going to be. The plan that emerges from these January debates bears little resemblance to the Cossack document Morgan laboured over. It's larger, riskier, more ambitious, and more expensive in every measurable way. 5 beaches instead of 3, 8 divisions instead of 3, twice the ships, 3 times the aircraft, supply requirements that dwarf anything previously attempted in warfare. Eisenhower has said no to the careful, constrained plan and replaced it with something that terrifies everyone involved, precisely because it's big enough that it might actually work. The equation has been rewritten, the variables have multiplied, the margin for error has shrunk to nearly 0, but for the first time since Casablanca, the invasion plan matches the scale of the promise that was made. Whether it matches the scale of German defences waiting in Normandy remains to be proven on beaches where theory will meet steel and blood. January 1944. Admiral Alan Kirk, the naval commander for the American invasion sectors, stands in his London office staring at a blackboard covered in equations that refuse to balance. He's trying to perform simple arithmetic that keeps producing impossible results. The number of landing ship tanks required minus the number actually available equals negative 142. You can't have negative ships. You can't land an invasion force without the vessels to carry them. And you can't build over 100 LSTs in 4 months when each ship requires 400,000 man-hours, 1,100 tons of steel, and 3 months of construction time under optimal conditions. Kirk erases the numbers and tries again, hoping mathematics will be more cooperative. The second time, the numbers don't change. The invasion that Eisenhower and Montgomery have redesigned, the 5-division assault that might actually succeed, requires ships that don't exist and can't be created in time. The plan is perfect. The resources are fiction. Understanding the landing craft crisis requires understanding what an LST actually is, and why building them became the bottleneck that nearly strangled Overlord. Landing ship tank, the LST, is an ungainly vessel, 328 feet long, 50 feet wide, flat-bottomed like a barge, but ocean-going, capable of crossing the English Channel in rough weather. The design allows it to beach itself, drive right up onto sand, then drop a bow ramp so that Sherman tanks and trucks can drive directly ashore. Each LST carries approximately 20 tanks, or 40 trucks, or 230 tons of supplies, making it the workhorse of amphibious warfare. But the design is complex. Reinforced bow for beaching, ballast tanks for stability, living quarters for crew and embarked troops, defensive armament against air attack. American shipyards can build cargo ships, Liberty ships, in weeks through mass production and prefabrication. LSTs require specialized construction, welding techniques that ensure watertight integrity, engine installations that provide enough power to retract off beaches after unloading. There's no shortcut. Every LST takes approximately 90 days from keel laying to launch, and that's if everything proceeds smoothly, which it never does. Production bottlenecks compound across the American industrial base. Steel, allocation. LSTs compete with destroyers, cargo ships, tanks, artillery, and every other steel-intensive war material. The War Production Board adjudicates these competing demands, and LSTs aren't always the priority. Shipyard capacity: only certain yards have the equipment and skilled labour to build LSTs. Expanding capacity means building new facilities, training new workers, creating supply chains for specialised components. By January 1944, American yards have delivered approximately 1,000 LSTs since production began in 1942. An impressive number that proves inadequate because the demands are global. The Pacific Theatre is consuming LSTs at a staggering rate. MacArthur's island hopping campaign, Nimitz's Central Pacific offensive operations in New Guinea, the Philippines, the Marshalls, every amphibious landing requires these ships, and they're being damaged, sunk, worn out faster than replacements arrive. The Mediterranean theatre has its own demands. The invasion of Sicily used 229 LSTs. The Anzio landing in January 1944 requires 98 LSTs that are now stuck in Italy, supporting a beachhead that's surrounded and can't be evacuated without disaster. Admiral King, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, becomes the bureaucratic villain in this drama, though from his perspective, he's defending legitimate needs. King has fought the Navy's war across the Pacific for 2 years, island to island, paying in blood for every atoll. He's not about to strip his forces of LSTs to support what he privately considers the British-dominated European theatre. The cable traffic between King and Eisenhower in January and February 1944 reads like a Cold War. Eisenhower requests transfer of 30 LSTs from Pacific to Europe, explains that without them, the invasion must be delayed or downsized. King responds that Pacific operations are already limited by LST shortages, that reducing numbers would hand initiative to the Japanese, that Europe must make do with Mediterranean resources. Eisenhower escalates to Roosevelt, arguing that defeating Germany is the agreed Allied priority, that the Second Front is a commitment to Stalin and can't be conducted with inadequate resources. King threatens resignation. The president mediates, ultimately ordering the Navy to transfer some LSTs to Europe while protecting Pacific minimums. The compromise satisfies no one, but preserves the command structure, barely. The Mediterranean becomes the more productive hunting ground for landing craft, and here Churchill's strategic preferences collide with Overlord's requirements. The Prime Minister has long favoured the Mediterranean strategy, the soft underbelly approach that attacks Germany through Italy and the Balkans, rather than the direct assault across the Channel. By early 1944, this strategy has produced mixed results. Italy invaded, Mussolini deposed, but German forces conducting a skillful fighting withdrawal up the peninsula, making the Allies pay for every mile. The Italian campaign ties down Allied divisions that could be in England preparing for Overlord, and it ties down landing craft that are desperately needed for the Normandy invasion. Operation Anvil, the planned invasion of southern France, represents another 40 LSTs committed to the Mediterranean. Eisenhower and his Chief of Staff, General Bedell Smith, argue that Anvil should be cancelled, its resources redirected to Overlord. Churchill resists, not wanting to abandon Mediterranean operations entirely, conscious that British forces are heavily committed there. The debate extends through February, with Roosevelt finally supporting Eisenhower's position. Overlord takes priority, Anvil is postponed indefinitely, the LSTs are transferred north. Even with Mediterranean transfers, the numbers barely work. The final tally, by late March, shows 233 LSTs available for Overlord, just 3 more than Eisenhower's minimum requirement. There's no reserve, no margin for losses, and losses are happening. Training accidents in the increasingly crowded waters around southern England are destroying ships faster than planners anticipated. On March 17th, 2 LSTs collide during night exercises off Portland, both damaged, requiring weeks of repair. On April 20th, an LST runs aground on an uncharted sandbar, rips open its hull, will be out of service until after D-Day. Every incident is a crisis, the careful mathematics collapsing toward failure. Admiral Kirk institutes new procedures: daytime training only, reduced speed during formation manoeuvres, mandatory inspection of every ship every 72 hours to catch mechanical problems before catastrophic failure. The restrictions reduce training effectiveness but preserve the ships, a calculation that accepts risk incompetency to avoid risk inavailability. Then comes Exercise Tiger, and the nightmare scenario manifests. April 28th, 1944, Slapton Sands on the Devon coast. The area has been evacuated of civilians, turned into a practice ground that resembles the Normandy beaches. Shingle, gradual slope, defensive obstacles. 3,000 soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division, the unit designated to assault Utah Beach, are conducting a full-dress rehearsal. 8 LSTs form a convoy carrying the troops, escorted by 1 British destroyer. The exercise is supposed to simulate every aspect of the real invasion. Night approach, naval bombardment, landing at dawn, securing the beachhead. At 2 a.m., German E-boats, fast torpedo boats operating from Cherbourg, penetrate the exercise area. The escort destroyer is refueling in port, leaving the LSTs unprotected. The E-boats attack with torpedoes. LST-507 takes a hit amidships, the explosion igniting fuel and ammunition stored on deck. The ship becomes an inferno, men jumping into water that's soaked with burning diesel. 6 minutes later, the ship sinks. LST-531 takes 2 torpedoes, breaks in half, goes down in minutes. LST-289 is damaged but stays afloat. The casualties are catastrophic. 749 American soldiers and sailors killed, more than will die on Utah Beach on D-Day itself. Bodies wash up on English beaches for days, each one a security nightmare, because military police must identify them, ensure none had bigot clearance, the highest security designation indicating knowledge of overlord details. 10 officers are missing, all with bigot clearance. If any are captured alive by Germans, if any talked before drowning, the invasion could be compromised. For 3 frantic days, intelligence officers search the channel, recovering bodies, checking IDs against lists. On May 2nd, the last missing officer is found dead, still wearing his life jacket. Eisenhower receives the report and exhales for the first time in 72 hours. The secret is intact, but the cost was nearly a battalion destroyed in training. Exercise Tiger exposes multiple failures that foreshadow D-Day problems. Radio frequency incompatibility. The LSTs operated on different frequencies than their escort ships, couldn't call for help when under attack. Life jacket errors. 60% of the drowning victims wore their jackets incorrectly around the waist instead of under the armpits, causing them to float face down. Convoy spacing. The ships were too close together, making them easy targets for torpedo attacks. Security lapses. The E-boats should never have reached the convoy, suggesting German intelligence or luck had created a gap in defences. Each failure is analysed, procedures changed, new training conducted. But the incident reveals a deeper truth. The invasion is being planned with the assumption that everything will work correctly, that equipment will function, that procedures will be followed, that luck will be neutral. Tiger proves that assumption is false. Things go wrong in war. Equipment fails. Procedures break down. Luck runs bad. The invasion will happen in an environment where Murphy's Law operates with full force. The landing craft shortage continues to dominate planning through May. The 3 LSTs lost or damaged at Tiger must be replaced from the tiny reserve. When intelligence reports show German E-boats are increasing patrols in the channel, additional escorts are assigned to protect the precious remaining ships, which pulls destroyers from other duties. When an LST suffers engine failure during a supply run, it's immediately replaced in the invasion fleet, even though the repair will only take a week, because there's no time to risk any ship being unavailable on D-Day. The final pre-invasion count shows 233 LSTs operational, the exact minimum. If 3 more ships are lost or damaged before June 6th, the invasion will have to be delayed or reduced in scale. Admiral Kirk sleeps poorly through May, checking casualty reports every morning, calculating whether his fleet will survive long enough to reach Normandy. The ships that didn't exist in January 1944 exist barely by June, scraped together from 3 theatres, transferred against the objections of other commanders, maintained through around-the-clock work by mechanics and welders who understand that loose bolts can lose wars. The landing craft crisis never fully resolves. It just becomes manageable enough to proceed. On June 1st, with the invasion 5 days away, Eisenhower receives the final naval status report. Sufficient ships available, marginally adequate reserves, weather and luck permitting. He signs off on the report and thinks about all the variables that had to align. King's grudging transfer of Pacific LSTs, Churchill's acceptance of Anvil's cancellation, exercise Tiger not being worse, training accidents not accumulating, German E-boats not getting luckier. The invasion is balanced on the thinnest possible logistical foundation. One more disaster, one more crisis, and the whole enterprise collapses back into impossibility. But the ships exist. Barely. That has to be enough. Because time is out. May 1942. Admiralty House, London. Winston Churchill sits in his private bathroom, the only place in the building where he can find a moment's peace from the endless meetings and decisions that consume every waking hour. He's testing an idea that sounds absurd, but might solve the invasion's most intractable problem. What if you could build a port that floats? Churchill fills the bathtub, places wooden models of breakwaters in the water, creates waves by hand, watches how the models respond. His private secretary finds him there an hour later, knee-deep in technical sketches, muttering calculations about buoyancy and concrete. The Prime Minister looks up and announces, "We shall have piers for use on beaches. You must make them ready for use by 1944. The order sounds like something from a dream, building harbours from nothing, floating them across the channel, anchoring them on enemy shores. But the invasion of Normandy has no port to capture, which means the Allies must bring their own or watch the operation starve on the beaches. The concept that becomes the Mulberry Harbours emerges from brutal necessity. Every amphibious assault in history has required capturing a functioning port within 24 to 48 hours of landing. Ports have the infrastructure to offload large volumes of cargo. Cranes, warehouses, railway connections, piers, where multiple ships can dock simultaneously. But Dieppe proved that attacking a defended port is suicidal, and intelligence reports show German demolition plans for Cherbourg, Le Havre, and every other harbour within reach of Normandy. Hitler's explicit orders are to destroy port facilities completely before retreating, deny the Allies any functioning harbour, force them to supply everything over open beaches where weather and surf can shut down operations for days. The only solution is artificial harbours, structures built in England, towed across the Channel, assembled on Normandy beaches to create instant ports. The engineering challenges are staggering. The concept is approved anyway because there's no alternative. 2 complete artificial harbours are planned, designated Mulberry A for the American sector at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B for the British sector at Arromanches Gold Beach. Each harbour will cover approximately 6 square miles of ocean, include 10 miles of floating roadway, handle 7,000 tonnes of cargo daily once operational. The main components are Phoenix caissons, massive concrete structures that will be sunk to form breakwaters. These are not small. Each Phoenix unit is 200 feet long, 60 feet tall, weighs 6,000 tonnes, larger than a 5-story apartment building. They must be built hollow so they float for towing, then flooded to sink precisely into position on the Normandy seabed. Over 100 are required, each one taking months to construct. Around Britain, construction sites spring up. Garston Harbour near Liverpool, Fastlane in Scotland, Portland, Southwick, locations with deep water access where concrete can be poured into massive forms. Steel reinforcement, welded into structures that must withstand Atlantic storms and German artillery. The engineering tolerances are unforgiving. Each Phoenix caisson must be watertight during towing, capable of surviving 3 days at sea while being pulled at 4 miles per hour by ocean-going tugs. The concrete must cure properly, strong enough to resist wave action but not so brittle it cracks during transport. Internal compartments must flood in the correct sequence when the units reach Normandy, allowing controlled sinking into position rather than capsizing. The math shows that if they depart English ports on June 5th or 6th, they'll reach Normandy by June 8th or 9th, meaning the harbours can't be operational until mid-June at earliest. For those critical first 10 days, everything must come across open beaches, vulnerable to weather, to surf, to German counterattacks. If a major storm hits before the Mulberries are positioned, the entire invasion could be strangled by lack of supply. Churchill understands this gamble, refers to it privately as the most difficult and daring of all the enterprises related to Overlord. Building the artificial harbours represents a £500 million investment, equivalent to perhaps $10 billion in modern currency, in structures that have never been tested at full scale and must work perfectly the first time. While engineers build the Mulberries, another group of specialists constructs an even more audacious fabrication. a fake army designed to deceive German intelligence into believing the invasion will strike at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Operation Fortitude is perhaps the most successful deception operation in military history, and its foundation is making the fictional seem absolutely real. The centerpiece is 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and positioned in Kent and Essex, the southeastern counties of England, directly across from Calais. FUSAG doesn't exist. It's a phantom army created with inflatable tanks, fake landing craft assembled from canvas and wood, radio traffic broadcast from empty fields, and double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. The phantom divisions have names, unit insignia, radio call signs, everything that would appear in German intelligence estimates except actual soldiers. The inflatable tanks are masterworks of deception engineering, rubber and canvas Sherman tanks that weigh perhaps 200 pounds but look perfect from aerial reconnaissance. German photo interpreters studying images from Luftwaffe, overflights, count these tanks and report massive armoured formations gathering opposite Calais. The fake landing craft are even more impressive. Wooden frames covered in canvas, dozens of them clustered in Dover Harbour where German observers can see them through binoculars from the French coast. British carpenters build these dummy craft with weathering and wear patterns, making them look used, operational, ready for invasion. The radio deception is most sophisticated. Signal units broadcast thousands of fake messages daily, creating the radio signature of corps headquarters, supply depots, armoured divisions, all the electromagnetic noise a real army would generate. German signals intelligence intercepts this traffic, analyses the patterns, concludes that a massive force is preparing to invade at Calais. The human dimension of Fortitude centres on double agents, German spies who've been captured and turned by British intelligence, now feeding false information back to their German handlers. The most valuable is Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British, Arabelle by the Germans, a Spaniard who created an entirely fictional network of sub-agents reporting from across Britain. Garbo's intelligence is so trusted in Berlin that his reports go directly to Hitler's desk. Through spring 1944, Garbo sends detailed dispatches about FUSAG's buildup, troop movements, equipment deliveries, training exercises, all confirming that Patton's army is preparing to strike across the narrowest point of the Channel. The reports mix truth with fiction, real Allied units in false locations, real equipment assigned to non-existent divisions, enough verifiable facts that German intelligence believes the fabrications. Garbo becomes so trusted that after D-Day, when he warns that Normandy is a diversion and the real invasion is still coming at Calais, German High Command keeps 15 divisions at Calais for weeks, waiting for an attack that never arrives. The deception extends beyond Fortitude to multiple operations, creating a web of false threats. Fortitude North suggests invasions of Norway, tying down German divisions in Scandinavia. Operation Bodyguard, the overall deception plan, includes diplomatic pressure on neutral countries to make German intelligence believe Allied plans are broader than Normandy alone. The cumulative effect is to dilute German focus, making them defend everywhere, rather than concentrating at the actual invasion site. By June 1944, German intelligence estimates show over 90 Allied divisions in Britain preparing for invasion. The actual number is approximately 37 divisions. The phantom divisions of Fortitude account for the difference, and German deployments reflect this distorted picture. The 15th Army sits at Pas-de-Calais with 22 divisions, the strongest concentration in France. The 7th Army holds Normandy with just 14 divisions, and these are generally lower quality, static, and training units. The success of Fortitude literally shapes the battlefield, creating a numerical advantage for Allied forces that doctrine says shouldn't exist. Testing the Mulberry components happens in piecemeal fashion through spring 1944, small-scale trials that can't fully validate whether the system will work under combat conditions. In April, several Phoenix units are towed from construction sites to assembly areas, demonstrating that they can survive sea transit without breaking apart, though the trips are short and in relatively calm water. The floating roadway sections, called whale pontoons, are tested in the Thames estuary, showing they can flex with waves without snapping. But nobody can test the complete system, can't assemble an entire artificial harbour under fire while German artillery targets the work crews, can't verify that all the components will integrate correctly when scattered across 6 square miles of turbulent ocean. The British conduct risk assessments that acknowledge catastrophic failure is possible. If the mulberries don't work, if they break apart during positioning or fail to protect landing craft from surf, the invasion won't necessarily fail immediately, but will be crippled, unable to build up forces fast enough to break out of the beachhead before German reinforcements arrive. By late May, the Phoenix caissons sit in harbours around England, looking like concrete barns floating in the water, strange and ungainly, destined for stranger purpose. The tugs that will tow them are positioned, crews briefed on routes and schedules. The sections will depart British ports in convoys spaced hours apart, following swept channels through German minefields, arriving at Normandy beaches beginning June 7th or 8th. Engineers calculate that positioning all units will take perhaps a week under optimal conditions, meaning the harbours won't reach full capacity until mid-June earliest. During that window, everything depends on weather staying calm enough for beach landings to continue, on German coastal artillery not targeting the mulberry components during assembly, on the tugs successfully positioning units without collision or capsizing. It's a cascade of dependencies, any one of which failing could bring down the entire structure. Churchill's bathtub experiment has become a £500 million gamble that can't be tested until it's too late to change the plan. The twin deceptions of Mulberry and Fortitude represent opposite approaches to solving invasion problems. Mulberry is engineering triumph, concrete and steel defying the laws that say ports must be carved from stone and built over decades. Fortitude is psychological warfare, making the enemy believe in armies that exist only as radio broadcasts and rubber tanks. Both are essential. Mulberry solves the physical problem of supplying an army without a port. Fortitude solves the strategic problem of preventing German forces from concentrating at Normandy by making them defend Calais against phantoms. Together, they create conditions where the invasion might succeed. Supplies flowing over artificial harbours. German reserves held away from the battlefield by deception. Neither can be admitted publicly. Mulberry's existence must remain secret until after D-Day so Germans don't prepare countermeasures. Fortitude must remain secret forever so Germans never realise they were fooled, ensuring future deceptions might work. Both are fragile. Both are essential. Both represent the invasion's dependence not just on courage and firepower, but on making the enemy see a false reality and building infrastructure from concepts that sound impossible. The harbours are made of concrete, but Patton's army is made of lies, and both are equally necessary for victory. March 1944. A briefing room in Berkshire, England. Paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division crowd around tables, covered with aerial photographs of Normandy, studying terrain they'll be landing on in darkness, behind enemy lines, miles from any friendly forces. The photos show farmland, small fields divided by hedgerows, roads and villages, and something troubling, large areas shaded grey, indicating water where there should be fields. Intelligence officers explained that Field Marshal Rommel has flooded sections of the Carentan Peninsula, damming rivers and breaching dikes, creating artificial lakes in designated drop zones. The paratroopers study these images in silence, understanding what flooding means. Instead of landing in fields, they might land in water 4 feet deep, weighted down with 100 pounds of equipment. Unable to swim, drowning in Norman farm country while Germans shoot from the safety of dry ground. Someone jokes that at least they won't need to dig foxholes. Nobody laughs. The airborne operation that's supposed to protect Utah Beach's western flank suddenly looks less like an assault and more like a sacrifice. The requirement for airborne forces emerges directly from Eisenhower's expansion of the invasion plan to 5 beaches. Utah Beach, the westernmost landing area added to the original 3-beach Cossack plan, sits at the base of the Carentan Peninsula with unique vulnerabilities. The only routes inland are 4 causeways crossing flooded areas behind the beach, narrow raised roads that are perfect kill zones if Germans control them. German artillery positioned on high ground around Santa Mare Église can fire directly onto Utah Beach, turning the landing area into a slaughter ground. The terrain naturally funnels any advance through choke points that small German forces could defend against much larger Allied units. The solution is airborne assault. Drop paratroopers and glider infantry inland before the beach landings. Seize the causeways, capture Saint Mare Église, destroy German artillery positions, block roads to prevent reinforcements from reaching the coast. It's strategically sound. It's also tactically insane. The mission parameters read like a catalogue of everything that can go wrong with airborne operations. 13,100 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions will jump from 822 C-47 transport aircraft beginning at 12:15 a.m. on June 6, 6 hours before the amphibious landings. They'll be jumping at night, in darkness, broken only by moonlight, from planes flying at 500 feet altitude, travelling 120 miles per hour. German anti-aircraft fire will be intense. Pilots have an average of 15 hours of night flying experience, barely enough to maintain formation in darkness, certainly not enough to navigate precisely while dodging flak. The drop zones are small, roughly 2 miles by 2 miles, and pilots must hit them within seconds of the planned time, or paratroopers will be scattered across the countryside. Once on the ground, troopers must find each other in darkness, assemble into fighting units without lights or radio communication that would attract German attention, then execute complex missions against defended positions, despite having no heavy weapons, no vehicle support, no armour. Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the senior British air commander, reads the airborne plan and concludes it's suicidal. He writes a memo to Eisenhower in May predicting 70% casualties in the first 6 hours, 9,100, 70 men killed or wounded before dawn, the equivalent of destroying both divisions for minimal gain. Leigh-Mallory argues that the risks vastly outweigh the benefits, that the paratroopers will be slaughtered in their drop zones or while scattered across flooded fields, that the mission should be cancelled and Utah Beach approach secured through different means. Eisenhower reads the memo, meets with Leigh-Mallory personally, and overrides the recommendation. The Supreme Commander's logic is coldly mathematical. If the airborne drops are cancelled, Utah Beach becomes indefensible, which means reducing the invasion back to 4 beaches, which means less frontage, less force, higher risk of the entire landing being contained and defeated. 70% casualties among airborne troops is horrible, but it's preferable to risking the failure of the entire invasion. Eisenhower tells Leigh-Mallory the operation proceeds as planned, then spends a sleepless night wondering if he's sending 2 divisions to their deaths. The training through April and May becomes increasingly frantic as the airborne divisions prepare for missions they've never attempted at this scale. Pathfinder units, volunteers who'll jump first to mark drop zones with radar beacons and lights, practice navigation in total darkness, learning to set up Eureka radar transponders that C-47 aircraft can home on. Using Rebecca receivers, the Pathfinders will jump 30 minutes before the main force, landing in enemy territory with no support, relying on surprise and luck to set up their equipment before German reaction. If Pathfinders fail, if the beacons aren't positioned correctly or are destroyed by German patrols, the main force will drop blind, scattered across potentially hundreds of square miles. Practice jumps over England reveal the difficulty. Even with experienced Pathfinders, even with good weather and no enemy fire, drop zones are rarely hit with precision. Paratroopers land scattered across miles, taking an hour or more to assemble, even when they know the terrain and aren't being shot at. The equipment each paratrooper carries is simultaneously essential and potentially lethal. Approximately 100 pounds per man, M1 rifle or Thompson submachine gun, ammunition, grenades, rations, water, entrenching tool, gas mask, first aid kit, extra socks, personal items. Some carry additional weapons, bazookas, machine guns, mortar tubes, ammunition for crew-served weapons. The leg bags are supposed to lower this equipment on a 20-foot line during descent, preventing hard landings, but the system is unreliable. Ropes break, bags are lost. Landing with 100 pounds strapped to your body from 500 feet, altitude guarantees injuries. Broken ankles, shattered knees, fractured vertebrae from hard impacts. Landing in water with 100 pounds means drowning unless you can cut free from your harness in seconds, underwater, in darkness, while disoriented from the impact. The training accidents pile up through spring. 18 men killed when 2 C-47s collide during night formation practice, 12 injured in hard landings, 5 drowned during water landing training. These are training losses, peacetime accidents. Combat will be exponentially worse. The glider infantry add another dimension of risk to the airborne plan. Gliders are engineered coffins, wooden frames covered in canvas, towed behind C-47 transports, then released to descend silently onto landing zones. British Horsa gliders carry 28 men. American Waco gliders carry 13. They have no engines, no power, minimal control surfaces. The pilot aims for a field, manages descent, and hopes the landing doesn't kill everyone inside. Glider pilots are technically officers but receive minimal flight training, just enough to control descent and aim for the right field, not enough to cope with unexpected winds or terrain obstacles. The gliders are meant to deliver heavier equipment that can't be parachuted. Jeeps, anti-tank guns, radio equipment, medical supplies. But first they have to land without disintegrating on impact. Practice landings show casualty rates of 10 to 15% simply from crashes, and that's in daylight on surveyed fields in England. Landing in darkness on unfamiliar Norman fields, studded with anti-glider poles that Rommel has been installing, will be catastrophic. Rommel's anti-airborne measures have been accelerating through spring 1944, and Allied intelligence watches with growing concern. The flooding of the Carentan is deliberate, engineered specifically to drown paratroopers. The Germans have breached dikes along the Douve and Murderet rivers, creating artificial wetlands that turn drop zones into swamps. Reconnaissance photos from May show water levels rising, areas that were dry fields in March now submerged under 4 feet of water. Rommel has also ordered Rommel's asparagus installed in potential glider landing zones. Wooden poles 15 feet tall, sometimes topped with mines or connected by wires, designed to rip gliders apart during landing. Thousands of these poles are being installed daily, and there's no way to remove them before the invasion without alerting Germans that these specific fields are intended landing zones. The pathfinders and glider pilots will have to navigate around them or through them, accepting casualties as the price of surprise. The psychological preparation is perhaps the hardest part. These are not elite troops in the modern special operations sense, though they're better trained than standard infantry. They're volunteers, men who chose airborne service for extra pay, $50 per month jump pay, or for the prestige of the paratrooper wings, or because they wanted to feel like they were doing something more than marching through mud. Now they're being asked to jump into darkness behind enemy lines with 70% predicted casualties, knowing they might land in water and drown, or land in trees and hang helpless while Germans shoot them, or land scattered and isolated and be captured before they can fire a shot. The chaplains work overtime in May, hearing confessions, leading prayers, offering what comfort they can to men who are statistically unlikely to survive the night of June 5th, 6th. Many paratroopers write final letters, seal them with instructions to mail if they don't return, hand them to company clerks with forced casualness. By late May, the airborne plan is locked in despite all the known problems. Flooding, anti-glider obstacles, inexperienced pilots, 70% predicted casualties, everything that should make rational commanders cancel the operation. But Eisenhower has decided, and the decision holds. The paratroopers will jump. The gliders will land. The missions will be attempted because without them, Utah Beach likely fails, and without Utah Beach, the entire invasion frontage contracts, and the margin for success shrinks to perhaps nothing. The men who will jump into darkness don't know all this strategic reasoning. They know their orders. Drop behind enemy lines, seize objectives, survive until dawn when hopefully the amphibious forces break through and link up. It's simple on paper. It will be chaos in execution. But chaos might be enough if it confuses Germans as much as it disorients Americans, if the scattered drops actually work in the Allies' favour by making German commanders think airborne landings are everywhere simultaneously. Leigh Mallory's prediction of 70% casualties will prove wrong. Not because the operation goes smoothly, but because prediction is impossible when you're asking men to do something never attempted before at this scale. The night of June 5th will be chaos. Whether it's productive chaos or catastrophic chaos won't be known until dawn breaks over Utah Beach, April 28th, 1944, 1:45 a.m. Off Slapton Sands, Devon coast. LST 507, designated T4, moves through darkness as part of an 8-ship convoy conducting Exercise Tiger, the final full-scale rehearsal for Utah Beach assault. The LST carries 300 men from the 4th Infantry Division, the unit that will lead the actual invasion in 5 weeks. Below decks, soldiers try to sleep on narrow bunks or sit on equipment, smoking, playing cards, trying not to think about the coming mock assault. On the bridge, the captain maintains formation, following the ship ahead by watching a dim blue stern light required by blackout regulations. The convoy is supposed to be protected by Royal Navy escorts, but due to a communications error, only one destroyer accompanies them, and it's dropped behind for refueling. Nobody aboard the LSTs knows that 9 German E-boats, fast torpedo craft operating from Cherbourg, have detected the convoy and are moving to intercept. At 1:58 a.m, the first torpedoes hit. LST-507 takes a torpedo. Amidships, the explosion ripping through fuel tanks and igniting ammunition stored on deck. The ship becomes an instant inferno, flames reaching 100 feet into the night sky. The entire midsection transformed into a fireball that consumes men before they can reach life jackets or rafts. On deck, soldiers are incinerated where they stand, flash burned into charcoal statues in poses of running or turning. Below decks is worse. Men trapped in compartments filling with smoke and flame, the watertight doors that are supposed to save the ship becoming ovens that cook men alive. Some manage to reach the main deck, find the ship tilting as water floods forward compartments, flames blocking paths to the stern where life rafts are stored. They jump into the channel, water temperature 50 degrees, cold enough to kill through hypothermia in 30 minutes, even without injuries. The ship breaks apart, 6 minutes after the first torpedo hit, bow and stern sections sinking separately, creating suction that pulls men under, drowning them in darkness. LST-531, designated T3, is second to die. 2 torpedoes strike within seconds of each other, one forward, one aft, breaking the ship's back. The LST breaks completely in half, both sections sinking in less than 2 minutes. Men below decks have no time to escape, trapped in compartments that become tombs. The ship taking them down into 200 feet of water in darkness and confusion. Those on deck face a different horror. The immediate sinking leaves no time for organised abandoned ship procedures. No time to deploy life rafts or even put on life jackets properly. Hundreds of men hit the water wearing their life jackets incorrectly, fastened around the waist instead of under the arms, as training prescribed. This simple error proves fatal. The jacket buoyancy forces their torsos vertical, but their heads underwater, drowning them face down while floating. Survivors will later say the worst part was hearing the screams, hundreds of men in the water calling for help, the sounds fading as hypothermia and drowning took them one by one. LST-289 survives. Though survives is relative when you're hit by a torpedo and on fire. The explosion tears open the stern, flooding engine rooms, killing crew instantly. Fire breaks out in berthing compartments, ammunition begins cooking off, explosions adding to the chaos. The captain manages to beach the LST on a sandbar, preventing complete sinking, but many men are already dead from the initial blast or trapped in flooded compartments. The survivors abandon ship into life rafts and swim towards shore 2 miles away, half of them not making it, succumbing to cold or wounds or exhaustion. By dawn, the water is littered with bodies, life rafts, debris, the wreckage of rehearsal transformed into massacre. British rescue ships recover survivors and corpses through the morning, the count rising hour by hour. 100 dead, 200, 500, finally stabilizing at 749 American soldiers and sailors killed in an exercise in friendly waters 5 weeks before the invasion. The security crisis hits immediately, almost overshadowing the casualty horror. 10 officers with Bigot security clearance are missing, Bigot being the code word designation for anyone with detailed knowledge of Overlord plans. Actual landing sites, timing, divisions involved, the information that would let Germans prepare a reception that could turn D-Day into catastrophic defeat. If any of these 10 officers are alive, captured by the German E-boats or washed ashore in German-controlled areas, if any talk before dying, the entire invasion is compromised. Eisenhower receives the Tiger casualty report on April 29th and immediately demands to know about the Bigot officers. Intelligence officers begin the grim work of identifying bodies, checking IDs against clearance lists, searching the channel for missing men. For 72 hours, the invasion hangs in balance, not because of German armies, but because of 10 missing officers who might be prisoners, might be talking, might be destroying 18 months of planning and preparation. May 2nd, 1944. The last Bigot officer is found, his body recovered from the channel, identified through dental records and fingerprints. All 10 are confirmed dead, none captured, the secret intact through pure luck. Eisenhower receives this confirmation and allows himself a moment of relief before returning to the harder questions. What went wrong with Tiger? How do we prevent it from happening on D-Day? Why did 749 men die in a training exercise 5 weeks before the invasion? The inquiries reveal cascading failures that read like a blueprint for disaster. Communication breakdown. The LST convoy was operating on different radio frequencies than their escorts, couldn't call for help when attacked. Escort failure. The Royal Navy destroyer that should have protected the convoy had returned to port for repairs, leaving the LSTs vulnerable. Intelligence failure. Nobody warned the exercise coordinators that German E-boats were active in the area. The attack was a complete surprise. Equipment failure. Many soldiers drowned while wearing life jackets because nobody verified they'd been trained in proper usage. The life jacket problem becomes its own scandal when investigators examine the bodies. 60% of drowning victims show the pattern. Life jacket fastened around the waist, body floating vertically, head underwater. The jackets were designed to be worn under the arms, against the chest, buoyancy, keeping the head above water even if unconscious. But in the chaos of sinking ships, in darkness and panic, men grabbed jackets and put them on wrong, fastened them as fast as possible and jumped, not realizing they'd just strapped on drowning devices. The training had been inadequate. A few hours of classroom instruction without sufficient hands-on practice, especially night practice in cold water. This realization forces a massive retraining effort in May. Every soldier scheduled for D-Day required to practice with life jackets in water until the proper donning becomes automatic. It's a grim lesson purchased with hundreds of lives, a training failure discovered through actual deaths. The survivors are immediately isolated, confined to guarded camps, with no communication with anyone outside, no letters home, no phone calls, instructions to tell families only that they're involved in training exercises. The official story released is vague. American forces suffered casualties during training exercises in the English Channel due to enemy action. The actual numbers are classified, the circumstances not revealed, the catastrophe buried under security classifications that won't be lifted for decades. The families of the dead received telegrams stating their sons or husbands or fathers died in training accidents, no details provided. The bodies in many cases not recovered and shipped home but buried in temporary graves in England. It's cruel necessity driven by security imperatives. If the story of Tiger became public, if the scale of the disaster was known, German intelligence would understand that a major operation is imminent, would analyse the exercise location and procedures and might deduce Normandy as the target. The dead of Exercise Tiger must stay secret so they don't become prophets of worse disasters to come. The tactical lessons are documented in reports that circulate to unit commanders through May, marked most secret and treated as scripture. Radio compatibility between ships and escorts is fixed, new frequencies assigned and tested, life jacket training is intensified. Every man required to demonstrate proper donning while blindfolded, simulating night conditions. Convoy spacing is increased, ships spreading out to prevent multiple hits from single torpedo spreads, naval escort procedures are tightened, more destroyers assigned, gaps in coverage eliminated. Anti-E boat patrols are increased along the channel, forcing German boats to operate more cautiously. Each fix addresses a failure from Tiger. Each procedure change is written in the blood of men who died, learning what doesn't work. The invasion will be executed with better training, better communications, better security than existed on April 28th. But the shadow of Tiger hangs over everything. 749 men died in practice. How many will die in reality? The German E-boat commanders who executed the attack never know the full impact of their mission. They report sinking 2 LSTs, damaging a third, estimate casualties at several hundred Allied soldiers. It's a successful patrol, a tactical victory, noted in German naval logs and used to argue for more E-boat deployments in the Channel. But German intelligence doesn't connect the attack to invasion rehearsals, doesn't deduce that the presence of fully loaded LSTs conducting night convoys suggests imminent amphibious operations. The bigot secret is preserved not just because all 10 officers died, but because German analysts don't ask the right questions about why so many troops were aboard ships in a training area. The Allies get lucky. Though luck is poor, comfort to the 749 families who receive telegrams about training accidents and wonder what training could possibly have killed their sons. Exercise Tiger remains classified for decades after the war, a disaster erased from official histories. The men who died there denied even the acknowledgement of sacrifice until long after anyone cared to remember. Their deaths improved the invasion plan, fixed problems that would have killed thousands more on Utah Beach, buy survival for men they never met through lessons learned in drowning and fire. It's a brutal calculus. But war is built on brutal calculations, and Tiger's dead contribute to victory through the negative lessons their deaths provide. June 3rd, 1944, 9:30 p.m. Southwick House, Portsmouth. General Dwight Eisenhower sits at the head of a table in a room that smells of cigarette smoke and damp wool, surrounded by the senior commanders who will execute or cancel the largest invasion in history based on what the next man says. Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist, stands near a weather map covered in symbols and pressure lines, holding a folder of data that represents the best guess about what the English Channel will do over the next 72 hours. Stagg is 44 years old, a Scotsman who speaks with precision that offers no comfort, a scientist asked to predict chaos. He clears his throat and delivers the forecast that every man in the room has been dreading. A major weather system is developing over the Atlantic. Storm conditions expected to hit the Channel on June 5th and continue through June 6th. Wind speeds 20 to 25 miles per hour, seas rough, cloud ceiling below 3,000 feet, visibility poor. The conditions violate every parameter required for the invasion. Stagg pauses, lets this sink in, then adds the conclusion everyone must face. If the invasion launches as scheduled on June 5th, it will launch into a storm. The meteorology behind this forecast is both primitive and miraculous. Given the tools available in 1944, there are no weather satellites providing global imagery, no computer models running atmospheric simulations, no real-time data from hundreds of observation stations. Stagg's team works with surface observations from ships at sea, reports from coastal weather stations in Britain and Ireland, upper atmosphere data from weather balloons launched twice daily, and readings from a few automated buoys in the Atlantic. The most critical gap is mid-Atlantic data. German forces occupy Norway and France, controlling weather stations that would normally provide advance warning of approaching systems. The Allies have no observations from the area between Greenland and Britain, where storms develop and gather strength. They're forecasting essentially blind, extrapolating from limited data, hoping their models of how weather systems behave match reality closely enough to avoid catastrophe. Stagg's forecast team is actually two teams, British and American meteorologists, who frequently disagree on interpretations, forcing Stagg to synthesize conflicting predictions into a single recommendation for Eisenhower. The British team, based at the Met Office at Dunstable, tends toward conservative forecasts emphasizing caution. The American team, based at Wide Wing Shah F headquarters, leans toward optimism, believing weather systems will move faster or weaken more than British models predict. Through early June, these teams argue over interpretation of fragmentary Atlantic data, neither able to prove their model is more accurate because the data simply doesn't exist. Stagg must reconcile their differences into a forecast he can defend, knowing that if he's wrong, thousands of men die and the invasion fails. It's an impossible position, making categorical predictions with inadequate information, but war doesn't care about impossibility. The June 3rd forecast is unanimous, both teams agreeing that a significant storm is approaching. The decision Eisenhower faces is stark: postpone the invasion or launch into weather that will likely cause massive casualties before German fire kills anyone. Postponement sounds simple but has complex implications. The invasion fleet is already loading over 5,000 ships preparing to depart ports across southern England according to carefully orchestrated schedules. The timing is synchronized, so vessels from different ports arrive at Normandy simultaneously at H-hour, the moment landing craft hit beaches. Calling it off now means recalling thousands of ships, unloading troops who've been briefed on objectives and carry knowledge of the invasion plan, keeping everyone confined to camps and bases while the secret grows harder to keep. The next suitable tide and moon combination is June 19th, 2 weeks away. 2 more weeks of risk that German intelligence discovers the plan. 2 more weeks of troops confined in camps going stir-crazy. 2 more weeks of everything that can go wrong before the invasion even launches. June 4th, 4:15 a.m. Eisenhower makes the first postponement decision, cancelling the June 5th D-Day. The messages go out to thousands of ships at sea, code words triggering recall procedures, vessels reversing course and returning to ports, troops who'd been seasick in rough channel waters disembarking to staging areas, the entire machinery of invasion grinding to a halt and reversing. It's organised chaos, a supreme test of communications and discipline, and somehow it works. The ships return, the troops disembark, the Germans apparently detect nothing unusual. But now everyone waits, confined to bases, knowing the invasion is imminent, but not when stress accumulating with each passing hour. Eisenhower returns to his quarters for a few hours of sleep that doesn't come, lying awake wondering if he's made the right call, if the weather would have been acceptable, if he's just delayed success or prevented disaster. June 4th, 9:30 p.m. The commanders gather again at Southwick House for Stagg's updated forecast, and this time the meteorologist offers something unexpected: a weather break. The storm system is moving faster than initially predicted, will clear the channel by evening of June 5th. Behind it, a brief window of acceptable conditions on June 6th, not perfect, but marginally adequate, lasting perhaps 36 hours before another storm system arrives. Winds will be 15 to 18 miles per hour, just under the maximum acceptable. Cloud ceiling will be 3,000 to 5,000 feet, enough for bombers to operate, though not ideal. Visibility will be 3 to 5 miles, adequate for naval gunfire. It's not the calm conditions planners hope for, but it's survivable. The question becomes whether to gamble on this narrow window or wait for June 19th and hope conditions are better then, with no guarantee they will be. The debate around the table reveals the pressure each commander feels through his particular lens of responsibility. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, naval commander, worries about landing craft in rough seas, soldiers seasick and disoriented before they even reach hostile fire, craft swamping in surf that's manageable in calm but dangerous in wind. Air Marshal Lee Mallory, still haunted by his prediction of 70% airborne casualties, worries that the cloud ceiling will ground bombers, leaving beaches without the preparatory bombardment that's supposed to suppress German defences. General Montgomery, commanding ground forces, is the most optimistic, acceptable weather that Germans won't expect. Might actually provide surprise, because German meteorologists will predict continued storms and not anticipate invasion. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, plays devil's advocate. What if Stagg's forecast is wrong? What if the window is narrower than predicted? What if the trailing storm arrives early and cuts off supply lines? Eisenhower listens to all of them, says little, makes notes on a pad. The weight of decision is visible in his posture, shoulders tight, face drawn. He's been awake for nearly 24 hours, sustained by coffee and cigarettes, carrying responsibility for an operation that will determine whether Nazi Germany can be defeated or survives to develop atomic weapons or negotiates a separate peace with Stalin. The decision isn't just about weather. It's about Allied unity, Stalin's faith that the Second Front will actually happen, British and American willingness to continue taking casualties, maintaining pressure on Germany before V-weapons level London. All of this rests on whether Stagg's forecast of a 36-hour window is accurate, and Stagg himself admits the forecast has uncertainty, that he's working with limited data, that he's offering his best professional judgment but cannot guarantee accuracy. June 5th, 4 a.m, Eisenhower calls for final opinions around the table. Montgomery votes go, arguing that acceptable conditions and German surprise outweigh risks. Ramsay is reluctantly affirmative, accepting that marginal weather is better than waiting 2 weeks with all the accumulated risks. Leigh Mallory remains pessimistic, but doesn't explicitly recommend cancellation. Tedder, Eisenhower's deputy, suggests waiting, concerned that the weather might deteriorate mid-operation, but he acknowledges the June 19th alternative has its own substantial risks. The room falls silent, all eyes on Eisenhower, who sits thinking for perhaps 30 seconds that feel like minutes. Then he nods once and says quietly, "Okay, we'll go." The decision is made, irrevocable, the invasion launching in 15 hours based on a weather forecast that might be wrong, into conditions that are barely acceptable, with the knowledge that if the forecast fails, thousands of men will die before they fire a shot. Eisenhower steps outside Southwick House into the pre-dawn darkness of June 5th, needing a moment alone before the machinery of war resumes its inexorable progression. The wind is blowing hard, clouds racing overhead, trees bending in gusts that suggest the storm hasn't fully passed. He lights a cigarette, stares at the turbulent sky, and thinks about all the variables that had to align. Stagg's forecast accurate, the weather break arriving on schedule, German meteorologists reaching different conclusions, German commanders not expecting invasion in marginal conditions. So much depends on chaos aligning into order for 36 hours, on German mistakes matching Allied gambles. Eisenhower finishes his cigarette and goes back inside, where staff officers wait for orders to transmit. where the invasion will resume because he's decided the window exists. Because weather forecasting 1944 is as much art as science. Because waiting might be worse than going. He's committed. The soldiers are loading onto ships again. The fleet will depart on schedule. The paratroopers will board their C-47s tonight. And if Stagg's forecast is wrong, if the window closes early, or conditions are worse than predicted, Eisenhower will carry responsibility for a disaster that could lose the war. But the decision is made. The window exists because he's decided it exists. That has to be enough. June 5th, 1944, 10 p.m, Portsmouth Harbour. HMS Scylla, flagship of the Naval Bombardment Force, slips her moorings and moves into the Solent, leading the first wave of what will become the largest naval armada ever assembled. Admiral Sir Philip Vian stands on the bridge watching hundreds of ships follow in precise sequence, their positions marked only by dim blue stern lights required by blackout regulations. The scene repeats simultaneously across a dozen ports. Plymouth, Portland, Weymouth, Poole, Southampton, Portsmouth, New Haven, each harbour disgorging its assigned vessels according to schedules calculated to the minute. Over 5,000 ships are moving tonight, from battleships displacing 35,000 tons to small landing craft barely larger than fishing boats, all converging on Normandy through swept channels in German minefields, following routes designated by coloured buoys visible only through binoculars. It's a ballet of violence, choreographed chaos. 8 separate convoys, departing from different ports, travelling at different speeds, all timed to arrive at 5 beaches simultaneously at 6:30 a.m. If even one convoy's navigation fails, if timing drifts by 30 minutes, the synchronization collapses and units arrive piecemeal to be destroyed in isolation. The minesweeper flotillas had departed 6 hours earlier, before sunset, beginning the most dangerous preliminary work. 245 minesweepers move ahead of the main fleet, sweeping 10 channels through German minefields that protect the French coast. The mines are various types: contact mines that explode when a ship hits them, magnetic mines that detonate when a metal hull passes overhead, acoustic mines triggered by propeller noise. The sweepers drag cables to cut contact mine moorings, use degaussing equipment to trigger magnetic mines at safe distance, produce noise to detonate acoustic mines before the fleet arrives. It's terrifying work, sailing at 4 knots through waters known to be mined, any moment potentially the last when an explosion tears the hull open. The crews see occasional flashes in the distance, mines detonating as they're swept, validation that the fields are real and deadly. By midnight, the channels are marked with Dan buoys, lighted markers showing the safe passage, and the main fleet begins threading through these narrow corridors. Captains watching their navigation obsessively, knowing that straying even 100 yards outside the swept channel means potential catastrophe. The convoys organise by speed and mission. Force U for Utah Beach departs from Devon ports, carrying the 4th Infantry Division and elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Support Units, travelling at 8 knots, the slowest speed to allow all vessels to maintain formation. Force O for Omaha Beach leaves from Dorset, carrying the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, slightly faster at 9 knots because their route is shorter. Forces G, J, and S for Gold, Juno and Sword. Beaches depart from Portsmouth and Southampton. British and Canadian forces in a massive convoy that stretches across 20 miles of ocean by the time it's fully assembled. The battleships and cruisers of the bombardment groups move independently, faster than the landing craft convoys, time to arrive at bombardment positions by 3 a.m, giving them nearly 4 hours to shell the beaches before H hour. The organisation is beautiful in its complexity, terrifying in its vulnerability. If German E-boats penetrate the formations as they did at Exercise Tiger, if U-boats somehow evade the screen and get among the transports, if Luftwaffe bombers break through the fighter cover, the losses would be catastrophic. The air campaign begins before the fleet is halfway across. Starting at 11 p.m. on June 5th, RAF heavy bombers begin pounding the Normandy coast. Lancasters and Halifaxes dropping 1,000-pound bombs on German strongpoints, attempting to destroy concrete bunkers and artillery positions before dawn. Over 1,000 bombers participate in the night strikes, flying in waves, each group assigned specific targets identified through months of reconnaissance. The bombing is area bombardment, saturation strikes intended to destroy everything in a grid square rather than precision hits on individual structures. The effectiveness is mixed. Concrete bunkers withstand near misses, requiring direct hits to be destroyed, and night navigation makes precision difficult. Many bombs land on empty fields behind the beaches, cratering farmland but missing the fortifications. But the psychological impact is substantial. German defenders experiencing hours of bombardment that keeps them in shelters, prevents sleep, disrupts communications, creates the impression that the entire coast is under attack. At midnight, the airborne operation begins, and the fleet at sea can see it happening. Hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft flying over the channel at 1,000 feet altitude, towing gliders, carrying paratroopers, heading toward Normandy in formation flights that stretch across the sky. The timing is synchronized so that paratroopers are on the ground by 1 a.m., securing objectives inland before the beaches are assaulted. The transport aircraft maintain strict radio silence, navigate by dead reckoning and visible landmarks, cross the French coast, and immediately encounter German anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds arc upward from dozens of positions, creating a web of coloured light, explosions blooming as flak shells detonate around the formations. Some aircraft are hit, catch fire, spiral down into darkness, trailing flames, and paratroopers who jump from burning planes too low for chutes to open properly. The fleet watches this from 20 miles offshore, seeing the light show, hearing distant explosions, understanding that the invasion has begun in darkness and chaos. By 2 a.m., the bombardment groups reach their assigned positions off the Normandy coast. Massive warships anchoring in pre-surveyed locations that put them within gun range of German fortifications, but, hopefully, outside the reach of German coastal batteries. Battleship Texas positions off Omaha Beach, her 14-inch guns capable of hurling 1-ton shells 15 miles inland. HMS Warspite, veteran of Jutland in the First World War, now 30 years old, positions off Sword Beach with 8 15-inch guns. USS Arkansas, even older, commissioned in 1912, takes position off Utah with 12-inch batteries. The cruisers fill gaps between battleships, 23 heavy and light cruisers, providing 8-inch and 6-inch guns. Behind them, 104 destroyers form a screen against U-boats and E-boats, while also preparing to provide direct fire support for landing troops. It's the most concentrated naval firepower ever assembled in one place, and in 3 hours, all of it will open fire simultaneously in a bombardment designed to shatter German defences through pure weight of metal. The loading procedures aboard the transports turn the ships into barely controlled chaos. Starting at 3 a.m, soldiers who've been below decks since departure are ordered topside, issued final equipment, formed into boat teams, and sent over the side into landing craft. The process happens in darkness, ships rocking in swells, soldiers burdened with 60 pounds of equipment plus weapons and ammunition trying to climb down cargo nets into small boats that rise and fall 15 feet with each wave. Men miss their footing, fall between ship and landing craft, are crushed when the craft rises on a swell and pins them against the hull. Some drop into the water, dragged down by equipment weight, rescued by alert sailors, or drowned in darkness. The landing craft themselves are barely seaworthy in the rough conditions. Flat-bottomed Higgins boats, designed for calm water, now pitching violently, taking on water over the bow, diesel fumes mixing with vomit from seasick soldiers who've been vomiting for hours and have nothing left to bring up but bile. The DD tanks, duplex-drive Shermans, fitted with canvas flotation screens and propellers, are supposed to launch from LSTs several miles offshore and swim to the beaches, providing armour support for the first infantry waves. The concept works in calm water but becomes suicidal in 3 to 4 foot swells. At Omaha Beach, the DD tanks are launched as planned, 6,000 yards offshore, within minutes. The first tanks swamp and sink, canvas screens collapsing in waves, tanks dropping through 30 feet of water to the seafloor, crews trapped inside, drowning in darkness as their vehicles become iron coffins. Of the 32 DD tanks launched for Omaha's eastern sector, 27 sink before reaching shore, taking their crews with them. The surviving tank commanders watch in horror as their comrades disappear beneath the waves, realize the entire concept has failed, that the infantry will hit the beach without armoured support. At Utah Beach, the launch is delayed and moved closer to shore after observers see what's happening at Omaha, saving most of the tanks but leaving them still several hundred yards out when the first infantry land. At 5 a.m, the sky begins to lighten, astronomical twilight giving way to nautical twilight. visibility increasing from nothing to grey shapes in darkness. The fleet is now fully visible from shore, thousands of ships stretching across the horizon. The largest invasion fleet in history, revealed to German observers in coastal positions, who begin frantically calling their headquarters to report what they're seeing. But by 5 a.m, it's too late for German forces to do much about it. The coastal divisions are already at maximum alert, the panzer divisions inland require Hitler's authorization to move, and Hitler is asleep at Berchtesgaden, nobody willing to wake him for what might be a diversion. The bombardment is minutes from beginning, the landing craft are already in the water heading towards shore. The invasion has become unstoppable through momentum, if nothing else. 5:50 a.m. The bombardment begins. 50 battleships and cruisers open fire simultaneously, a rolling thunder that can be heard in England 40 miles away, the concussion rattling windows in Portsmouth. The battleships fire salvos that create orange flashes visible for miles, each 14-inch shell weighing a ton, leaving the barrel at twice the speed of sound, impacting German positions with explosive force that creates craters 30 feet deep. The cruisers add their weight, 6-inch and 8-inch shells, landing at rates of multiple rounds per minute per gun, saturation, fire that blankets entire grid squares. The destroyers close to within 2,000 yards of shore, point-blank range for naval guns, firing directly at pillboxes and bunkers identified in reconnaissance photos. The noise is beyond description, a continuous roar that makes communication impossible except by shouting directly into someone's ear. The German response is sporadic and ineffective. Coastal batteries return fire from fortified positions, their shells creating towering splashes near the Allied ships, but accuracy is poor because German rangefinders are destroyed or suppressed by the bombardment, because smoke and dust obscure targets, because the sheer volume of incoming fire makes sustained counterfire impossible. One German battery at Longueuil-sur-Mer, between Gold and Omaha beaches, manages several salvos that straddle HMS Bulolo before being silenced by direct hit from a 15-inch shell from HMS Ajax. Another battery at Pointe du Hoc, supposedly destroyed by bombing, reveals itself to be intact and begins firing at the approaching fleet until destroyers assigned to suppress it concentrate their fire, smothering the position under hundreds of 5-inch shells. By 6:15 a.m, 40 minutes of naval bombardment have expended over 50,000 shells, more ammunition than was fired in the entire Battle of Jutland in World War I. The visible effect is massive. Huge sections of the bluffs behind the beaches are on fire, smoke rising hundreds of feet, entire hillsides collapsing from direct hits. But inside the concrete bunkers, German defenders survive, the bunkers built to withstand heavy naval guns. 6 feet of reinforced concrete absorbing hits that would destroy any other structure. As the bombardment lifts, shifting to targets further inland to avoid hitting the incoming landing craft, German soldiers emerge from shelters, man their weapons, and prepare to fire on the Americans and British and Canadians who are now just minutes from the beach, close enough to see individual waves breaking on the sand, close enough to count the seconds until the ramps drop and they run forward into whatever awaits them. The Armada has crossed. The fleet has delivered its soldiers to the edge of Hitler's Europe. Now comes the part where courage and luck determine whether those soldiers survive the next 30 minutes, whether they gain the beach or die in the surf, whether the most complex military operation in history succeeds or becomes the most catastrophic failure. The ships have done their part. The rest depends on men in small boats, approaching beaches defended by Germans who have waited 4 years for this moment. June 6th, 1944, 6:30 a.m, Omaha Beach, the bow ramp of landing craft LCV P-327 drops onto sand, and Sergeant Raymond Hoback of the 29th Infantry Division steps forward into water that's waist-deep, colder than expected, pulling at his legs as he tries to run toward the beach 70 yards away. The machine gun fire begins immediately. MG-40, 2 German machine guns firing from bunkers on the bluffs, each gun capable of 1,200 rounds per minute, interlocking fields of fire that turn the water around Hoback into a churning foam of impacts. Men to his left and right are hit before taking 3 steps, falling face down into surf that turns red, bodies floating in the waves. Hoback makes it perhaps 20 yards before a burst catches him across the chest, and he goes down thinking about letters he'll never send to his family in Virginia. His body will wash up on the beach 3 days later, identified through letters in his pocket, one of 2,500 men who will become casualties on Omaha in the next few hours. This is not how the plan said it would go. The plan for Omaha Beach assumed that naval bombardment and aerial bombing would suppress German defences, that DD tanks would reach shore to provide covering fire, that the first infantry waves would cross the beach and reach the seawall with casualties around 10%. Manageable losses that would allow follow-up waves to push through and begin the advance inland. Every single assumption proves wrong. The naval bombardment, while impressive, largely missed the bunkers or failed to penetrate their thick concrete walls. The aerial bombardment dropped over 13,000 bombs on Omaha, but nearly all landed too far inland, cratering fields and villages miles behind the beach while leaving the immediate defences intact. 27 of 32 DD tanks sank before reaching shore, drowning their crews, eliminating the armour support the infantry desperately needs. And the German defenders are not the second-rate static. Division intelligence predicted, but elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, experienced troops transferred from the Eastern Front, combat veterans who know how to use the terrain and who refuse to panic under bombardment. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment lands at 6:30 a.m. in the zone designated Easy Red, directly in front of a fortified draw that's the only viable exit from the beach in this sector. The Germans have prepared this killing ground carefully. Bunkers positioned to provide enfilading fire down the length of the beach, mortars pre-registered on the waterline, machine gun nests in the bluffs with overlapping fields of fire. As the company's 6 landing craft approach, German observers identify them as the lead element and concentrate fire. The first craft to drop its ramp takes machine gun fire directly into the troop compartment, killing the lieutenant commanding and half the boat team before they can exit. The second craft hits a mine, explodes, sinks instantly. The third craft's ramp jams, forcing men to jump over the sides into water over their heads, weighted down by equipment, several drowning immediately. Within 10 minutes, Company A is combat ineffective, over 90% casualties. The survivors pinned at the waterline, unable to advance or retreat, lying behind beach obstacles for cover, some wounded men drowning as the tide rises. On the bluffs above, Corporal Franz Gockel of the 352nd Division fires his MG-42 in disciplined bursts, targeting landing craft as they approach, shifting to individual soldiers once the ramps drop. He's been in position since the bombardment ended, his machine gun sighted to cover the waterline, fed by an assistant gunner who keeps belts of ammunition feeding smoothly. Gockel has fought Russians, seen their massed attacks, knows how to stay calm and fire steadily. The Americans approaching seem disorganized, scattered, many falling before they reach cover. He fires until his barrel overheats, changes it quickly, resumes firing. The bunker he's in has 6 feet of concrete overhead, absorbed multiple direct hits from naval shells without serious damage, and his position is almost impossible for the Americans to suppress without tanks or artillery that can fire directly at his firing slit. He will fire nearly 10,000 rounds today before being wounded by a destroyer shell that finally penetrates close enough to cause casualties through concussion. By 7 a.m., an hour after the first landings, Omaha Beach is approaching catastrophe. 8 landing craft have been destroyed by mines or direct hits, their survivors swimming through debris and bodies, trying to reach shore. The beach obstacles are taking a terrible toll. Stakes topped with mines, steel hedgehogs, Belgian gates, all positioned to rip the bottoms out of landing craft or detonate when struck. The Navy beach teams assigned to clear obstacles are being killed as fast as they work engineers trying to place explosives while under machine gun fire, many dying before completing their tasks. The follow-up waves are landing into chaos, craft dodging obstacles and wreckage, coxswains trying to find clear spots on a beach that has no clear spots, dumping troops into water too deep or directly in front of German strongpoints. The bodies are accumulating at the waterline, the wounded unable to move inland, medics trying to provide aid while pinned down themselves, casualties mounting toward 1,500 in the first 90 minutes. Simultaneously, Utah Beach is succeeding beyond expectations, and the contrast reveals how much D-Day depended on luck and German mistakes. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry, lands with the first wave on Utah and immediately realizes they're in the wrong place, approximately 2,000 yards south of the planned landing zone. Strong currents have pushed the landing craft off course, and instead of landing at the designated point, they've come ashore in a lightly defended sector. Roosevelt, at 56, the oldest man in the first wave, walks the beach under sporadic fire, makes the critical decision. We'll start the war from right here. He orders follow-up waves redirected to the actual landing point rather than the planned point, effectively changing the assault plan on the fly. The decision is brilliant. The actual landing site has fewer defences, better beach exits, and allows the 4th Infantry Division to move inland rapidly. By 9 a.m, Utah Beach has casualties under 200, linked up with some paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, and is pushing toward its D-Day objectives. Roosevelt will receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership, though he'll die of a heart attack 6 weeks later, worn out by the stress of command. The British and Canadian beaches show similarly mixed results. Sword Beach lands the British 3rd. Infantry Division, under heavy but manageable fire, pushes inland 6 miles by afternoon, comes within 3 miles of Caen before being stopped by elements of the 21st Panzer Division, counterattacking from the city. Juno Beach sees the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division face the strongest initial resistance of the British sector, takes heavy casualties in the first hour, but breaks through German defences and advances inland. Gold Beach experiences moderate resistance, lands the British 50th Infantry Division successfully, and by evening has linked up with Canadian forces from Juno. The British sector demonstrates what happens when the plan mostly works. Casualties are substantial but acceptable, objectives are being taken, the beachhead is expanding. The difference between British success and American crisis at Omaha comes down to luck. The British faced the German 716 Division, as expected, lower quality troops who fought but broke under pressure. The Americans at Omaha hit the 352nd Division by pure chance, that unit having moved into the sector days before for training exercises, creating a defensive strength that intelligence never predicted. By 8:30 a.m, General Omar Bradley aboard USS Augusta, flagship of the American Naval Forces, has received fragmentary reports from Omaha that paint a picture of potential disaster. Radio communications are sporadic, most sets destroyed or waterlogged, but the messages that get through are alarming. Massive casualties, troops pinned down, unable to advance, follow-up waves landing into killing zones. Bradley considers evacuating Omaha Beach, redirecting forces to Utah or the British beaches where landings are succeeding, but evacuating means abandoning thousands of men already ashore, means contracting the invasion frontage, means potentially allowing Germans to concentrate against a narrower beachhead. He holds the decision, continues landing troops at Omaha despite the casualties, gambling that the situation will improve, that leadership and courage will somehow turn catastrophe into success. That improvement begins through small acts of individual initiative, junior officers and NCOs making decisions that doctrine doesn't cover. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment lands on Easy Red Sector at 8:15 a.m, sees the carnage, realises that staying on the beach means death, but advancing means death with purpose. He shouts above the gunfire, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." He begins organising small groups to attack the bluffs, not following the plan anymore because the plan has disintegrated, just moving forward because forward is the only direction that matters. Other officers and sergeants across Omaha make similar decisions, abandoning the idea of coordinated assault waves, just gathering whoever's nearby and moving. Some groups find gaps in the defences, gullies or draws, where German fire isn't perfectly interlocking, infiltrate up the bluffs in small teams. Destroyers offshore take enormous risks, moving to within 800 yards of the beach, point-blank range, firing directly at German bunkers they can see, suppressing positions long enough for infantry to advance. By 10 a.m, the German defensive line begins to crack, not through overwhelming Allied force, but through gradual attrition and infiltration. American troops reach the top of the bluffs in multiple locations, get behind German positions, attack strong points from unexpected angles. German communication breaks down as American fire cuts telephone lines connecting bunkers to command posts, leaving individual positions fighting in isolation without coordination. Ammunition runs low in German machine gun nests, the high rate of fire consuming belts faster than runners can bring replacements through American fire. Some positions surrender when Americans appear, behind them the defenders, having fought courageously but now cut off with no chance of survival. Other positions fight until destroyed, gun crews dying at their weapons, testimony to either dedication or fatalism depending on perspective. By noon, Omaha Beach is secured in the sense that troops are off the beach and advancing inland. Though secured is generous for a beach still under sporadic artillery fire, littered with destroyed vehicles and over 1,000 dead. The scene is apocalyptic. Bodies in the surf, wounded men scattered across the sand, being treated by medics, burned out landing craft, disabled vehicles, unexploded ordnance, fires burning, smoke drifting across water stained with oil and blood. The destroyers and cruisers continue firing at targets inland, supporting the advance off the beach, their ammunition expenditure exceeding any previous single-day naval gunfire mission in history. The follow-up waves continue landing, troops and vehicles moving past the carnage to push the advance. Accepting that D-Day at Omaha didn't go according to plan, but went far enough to matter. By late afternoon, across all 5 beaches, 156,000 Allied troops are ashore, slightly more than the plan anticipated despite the chaos at Omaha. The beachhead is not as deep as expected, 2 to 6 miles rather than the planned 10 miles. Cane not captured, many D-Day objectives not achieved. But the landings have succeeded in the most fundamental sense. The Allies are ashore in force. The beachhead is expanding. German counterattacks have been repulsed or failed to materialize. And the supply buildup is beginning. The casualties are substantial but manageable. 4,414 confirmed dead across all beaches, roughly 3% of the landing force, far less than the 10% or higher predicted by pessimistic estimates. But behind these statistics are individual tragedies. Men like Sergeant Hoback, who died in the surf. Men who drowned in sinking tanks. Men who burned in destroyed landing craft. Men whose families will receive telegrams in coming days stating that their sons or husbands or fathers were killed in action on June 6, 1944, in the liberation of Europe. The steel rain has fallen. Many have died, but many more have survived and gained the beach. The outcome is not the clean success that doctrine promised, but the messy, costly, partial success that warfare typically delivers. It's enough. Barely, but enough. The question now is whether this toehold can be expanded into Breakout before German reserves arrive to crush it. June 6, 1944, 7 a.m. La Roche-Guyon, France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's headquarters, housed in a chateau overlooking the Seine 50 miles from Normandy. A staff officer wakes Rommel with news that paratroopers have been reported near Caen. Naval bombardment is hitting the Normandy coast. This might be the invasion. Rommel, who had driven to Germany the previous day for his wife's birthday, believing the weather too poor for invasion, now stares at maps, trying to assess whether this is the real assault or another diversion. He issues orders to move available reserves toward Normandy, then places urgent calls to OKW, the German High Command, requesting immediate release of panzer divisions held in reserve. The staff officer, taking his call, explains that panzer release requires authorization from the Führer personally, and the Führer is currently sleeping at his Berchtesgaden retreat, and standing orders are that he's not to be disturbed before 10 a.m. Rommel slams the phone down, understanding that the most critical hours of the invasion will pass while German armoured reserves sit immobile, waiting for one man to wake up and make a decision that should have been delegated weeks ago. This single command paralysis will prove more valuable to the Allies than any bombing raid or naval bombardment. The German command structure in France is a masterpiece of dysfunction, competing authorities and unclear chains of command that guarantee paralysis in crisis. Rommel commands Army Group B, responsible for coastal defence from the Netherlands to the Loire, but he reports to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, who has different strategic views and limited respect for Rommel's emphasis on defeating invasions at the beach. The panzer divisions, the strategic reserve necessary to counterattack any landing, are split into 2 groups, some under Rommel's direct control, others held in OKW reserve and movable only with Hitler's personal authorization. This arrangement reflects Hitler's distrust of his field commanders and his desire to maintain personal control over strategic decisions, but it means that in the critical first hours of the invasion, nobody can mass armour against the beachhead without waiting for approval from a man who's asleep 400 miles away. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen and directly facing the British beaches, receives reports of the invasion at 6:30 a.m. and immediately requests authorization to counterattack. The division commander, General Major Edgar Feutinger, has over 100 tanks and supporting infantry ready to move, positioned within 10 miles of the beaches where British forces are landing. But doctrine requires authorization from higher command. He requests permission from Rommel's Army Group B headquarters. They refer the request to von Rundstedt's headquarters. Von Rundstedt's staff explains that moving panzer divisions requires OKW authorization. OKW staff won't wake Hitler. The 21st Panzer sits in place, engines running, waiting for orders while British forces land unopposed by armour and begin pushing inland. When authorization finally comes at 3 p.m, 9 hours after the invasion began, British forces have already established defensive positions, brought anti-tank guns ashore, called in naval gunfire support. The 21st Panzer attacks at 4 p.m, reaches the coast between Juno and Sword beaches, briefly creating the possibility of splitting the British beachhead, then withdraws after taking casualties from naval guns and lacking infantry support to exploit the penetration. The counterattack, launched at dawn with surprise and momentum, might have succeeded. Launched 9 hours late against prepared positions, it achieves nothing except validating Rommel's long-held argument that panzer divisions must be positioned close to the coast and must be released immediately when invasion occurs. Hitler finally wakes at 10 a.m, receives briefings about the Normandy landings, and makes the assessment that dooms German counteraction. He believes Normandy is a diversion. The real invasion is still coming at Pas de Calais, therefore the panzer reserves must be held to meet that main threat. This assessment is partly driven by Operation Fortitude's success, the deception operation that convinced German intelligence that Patton's Phantom 1st US Army Group is preparing to invade at Calais. Hitler's intelligence briefings show over 90 Allied divisions in Britain, only 37 actually landing at Normandy, suggesting that more than half the Allied force is still positioned opposite Calais. The logic seems sound. Normandy is a secondary effort meant to draw German reserves away from Calais, where the real blow will fall. Hitler therefore releases some panzer divisions to Normandy but orders others held at Calais, splitting his strategic reserve, ensuring neither location receives overwhelming force. This decision, maintained for weeks despite mounting evidence that Normandy is the only invasion, keeps 15 German divisions at Pas de Calais waiting for phantom armies, while the Normandy battle is decided by forces that are actually there. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the best equipped and most fanatical German units in France, begins moving toward Normandy on the afternoon of June 6 after finally receiving authorization. The division is composed primarily of 18 and 19-year-old volunteers from the Hitler Youth, extensively trained, equipped with the newest tanks and equipment, led by experienced officers from the Eastern Front. They should reach the Normandy front by evening of June 6th, but Allied air supremacy transforms the movement into a nightmare. Fighter bombers from RAF and American squadrons patrol the roads in shifts, attacking anything that moves, forcing the division to travel only at night, hide during daylight under camouflage or in forests. The journey that should take 6 hours stretches to 3 days, the division arriving piecemeal, having lost vehicles and men to air attacks, their cohesion disrupted before they ever engage Allied ground forces. This pattern repeats across every German unit trying to reach Normandy. Movement by day is suicide, movement by night is slow, Allied aircraft are everywhere, and the build-up of German strength happens at a fraction of the rate necessary to overwhelm the Allied beachhead before it consolidates. The Panzerlehr Division, perhaps the best equipped armoured division in the entire Wehrmacht, also receives movement orders on June 6th and begins the approach from Le Mans, 100 miles from the coast. The division has 183 tanks and tank destroyers, mostly Panthers and Mark IVs, with supporting mechanised infantry and artillery. In peacetime conditions, the movement would take a single day. Under Allied air attack, it takes 5 days, the division losing over 100 vehicles to airstrikes before ever reaching combat, arriving at the front exhausted and depleted. The commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later states that he lost more vehicles moving to Normandy than in his first week of actual combat, that the Allied fighter-bomber umbrella made daylight movement impossible, and night movement so slow that reinforcement became a trickle when it needed to be a flood. By evening of June 6th, the assessment from both sides acknowledges a partial Allied success. The Allies have landed 156,000 troops across 5 beaches, established a continuous beachhead about 50 miles wide and 2 to 6 miles deep, repulsed or prevented German counterattacks, and begun the build-up of supplies and reinforcements. The casualties are 4,414 dead, higher than hoped but far lower than feared, particularly lower than the predicted 10,000 that haunted planning conferences. The failure to take Caen, the failure to push 10 miles inland, the failure to link all beaches on D-Day itself. These are disappointments but not disasters. The fundamental objective is achieved. The Allies are ashore in force and staying there. The German assessment is more troubled. The coastal defences have fought well but been overwhelmed. The German assessment, Atlantic Wall proving less impregnable than propaganda suggested. The failure to release panzer reserves immediately has allowed Allies to consolidate without facing armoured counterattacks in the vulnerable first hours. The continued belief that Normandy is a diversion means German strategy is based on fighting the wrong battle, holding forces at Calais against a threat that doesn't exist, while the actual invasion expands its beachhead. Some German commanders, including Rommel, already understand that June 6th might be the decisive day of the Western Front, that if the Allies can't be thrown back into the sea immediately, the build-up of Allied material superiority will make eventual German defeat inevitable. But this assessment doesn't reach Hitler, who remains convinced that Normandy is secondary, that patience and proper positioning will allow German forces to defeat both the Normandy landing and the expected Calais invasion. The gap in the guns, the hours when German artillery and panzers could have concentrated against the beachhead but instead sat immobile waiting for orders, proves decisive. By the time German armour arrives in strength, Allied forces have brought their own tanks ashore, established anti-tank defences, positioned artillery, called in naval gunfire support that can reach miles inland. The window for an immediate counterattack that might have succeeded closes during those first 12 hours while Hitler slept and staff officers waited for authorization, and Operation Fortitude continued deceiving German intelligence about where the real threat existed. The Allies don't win D-Day through perfect execution. Their plan fragments at Omaha, casualties exceed estimates, objectives aren't met. They win through German mistakes being larger than Allied mistakes, through having enough redundancy that partial failure doesn't equal complete failure, and through facing an enemy whose command structure guarantees that theoretical advantages never translate into actual battlefield presence when it matters most. By nightfall on June 6th, both sides are digging in, establishing defensive positions, preparing for the battle they now understand is coming. A grinding attrition struggle to expand or contain the beachhead, a race between Allied build-up and German reinforcement, a test of whether material superiority can overcome defensive terrain. The invasion has succeeded in establishing the second front that Stalin demanded, that Roosevelt and Churchill promised at Casablanca 18 months ago. Whether this foothold can be expanded into liberation remains uncertain, dependent on supplies continuing to flow across open beaches, on artificial harbours being positioned successfully, on German reinforcements being delayed or destroyed before they can mass for counterattacks. The gap in the guns on D-Day has given the Allies the time they needed. Whether they can exploit that time determines if Normandy becomes the beginning of victory or another Anzio, a beachhead that achieves nothing except consuming lives in stalemate. The first day is over. The next 90 days will decide the war. June 19th, 1944, 9 a.m., Omaha Beach. American supply officer Lieutenant James Morrison stands on the bluff overlooking the beach and watches the English Channel transform into something from a nightmare. The wind has been rising since dawn, now gusting to 40 miles per hour, whipping sand and spray across the beach, creating waves 6 to 8 feet high that crash onto the shore with explosive force. Landing craft attempting to beach are being swamped, thrown sideways, smashed against the steel obstacles that are still being cleared 13 days after D-Day. Morrison watches an LCM, landing craft mechanized, approach carrying a load of artillery ammunition, get caught sideways by a wave, capsize, and sink in 30 feet of water with its cargo and crew. It's the fourth landing craft he's watched sink this morning, and the storm is just beginning. The meteorologists are predicting 3 days of this, perhaps 4, the worst channel storm in 40 years, arriving at the exact moment when the invasion beachhead depends entirely on supplies flowing across open beaches. This is the contingency nobody planned for adequately. Not German counterattacks, not casualties, but weather that simply shuts down logistics and threatens to starve the army that's fighting inland. The storm arrives without warning that would have allowed preparation. Group Captain Stagg and his team of meteorologists, who successfully predicted the June 6th weather window, completely miss this system developing over the Atlantic. The combination of limited observation posts, no weather satellites, and the chaotic atmospheric conditions of June 1944 creates a blind spot. The storm forms quickly, intensifies, faster than models predict, and hits the Normandy coast with winds and waves that exceed any conditions experienced during training. The American Mulberry A Harbour at Omaha, still under construction, has approximately half its components positioned when the storm hits. The Phoenix caissons, the massive concrete breakwater units, are anchored but not yet fully secured, vulnerable to being shifted by extreme wave action. The whale pontoon roadways, floating piers designed to allow trucks to drive from ships to shore, begin flexing beyond their design limits, connections breaking, sections sinking or breaking loose. By noon on June 19th, the storm's full fury is evident. Winds reach force 6 on the Beaufort scale, officially designated as strong breeze, but experienced as gale force at beach level where there's no shelter. The waves grow to 10 feet, occasionally 12 feet, creating conditions that would close any harbour in normal circumstances. But Normandy doesn't have the option of closing. Over 200,000 troops are ashore, consuming approximately 40,000 tonnes of supplies daily, and every hour the beaches are shut down means the supply cushion drops. Morrison's inventory reports from that morning show ammunition down to 3 days, fuel to 4 days, rations adequate but medical supplies running low. If the storm continues for 4 days as predicted, the entire invasion could be on starvation rations before resupply becomes possible. The landing craft losses accelerate through June 19th and 20th. Smaller craft, Higgins boats and LCVPs, are pulled off the beach operations entirely, too vulnerable to capsizing in the surf. Even the larger LSTs and LCTs struggle, many broaching in the surf, driven sideways onto the beach where they become immobilized, blocking landing zones, creating additional obstacles. By the evening of June 20th, over 800 landing craft have been destroyed or damaged severely enough to require major repairs. These are the craft that Exercise Tiger failed to protect, that the landing craft shortage nearly cancelled the invasion over, now being destroyed not by German action but by weather. Each loss represents not just a vessel but transport capacity, the ability to move supplies from England to France, and with 800 craft gone, the supply flow drops to perhaps 25% of required capacity. The British Mulberry B Harbour at Arromanches Gold Beach weathers the storm better than its American counterpart, partly through luck, partly through being farther along in construction when the storm hit. The British engineers had positioned more of the Phoenix caissons before June 19th, creating a more complete breakwater that provides some shelter for the inner harbour. But even Mulberry B suffers damage. Several Phoenix units shift position, creating gaps in the breakwater that allow waves to penetrate. Whale pontoon sections break loose, some sinking, others driven onto the beach where they become obstacles. The bombardons, floating steel, breakwaters positioned outside the Phoenix line, break their moorings and drift, some washing up on the beach, others disappearing into the channel. The British harbour will survive and eventually handle its designed cargo capacity, but it will take weeks to fully repair the storm damage. American Mulberry A at Omaha essentially disintegrates. By June 21st, when the storm begins to subside, the harbour is a wreck. Phoenix caissons scattered and broken, whale sections sunk or driven ashore, the harbour roadways destroyed, the entire structure rendered inoperable. The final assessment determines that rebuilding would take longer than capturing and repairing Cherbourg port, so the decision is made to abandon Mulberry A as a total loss. The cost in materials and labour represents over £250 million, perhaps $5 billion in modern currency, an entire artificial harbour built over months, towed across the channel, positioned with tremendous effort, then destroyed by weather in 3 days. Churchill, receiving the casualty report on his pet project, remarks bitterly that the Mulberries were supposed to protect the invasion from the one thing they couldn't control, the sea itself. The supply crisis that develops during the storm forces desperate measures. With landing craft destroyed and the artificial harbours damaged or destroyed, the only option is direct beaching of coasters and small freighters at low tide, driving them as far up the sand as possible, unloading directly onto the beach, then waiting for high tide to refloat them. This technique, called drying out, is dangerous and damaging to the ships, but allows some supply flow to continue. Engineers also work frantically to clear beach obstacles that are now navigation hazards rather than just German defences, blowing up Belgian gates and Element C steel hedgehogs to create clearer landing zones. The priority shifts from expanding the beachhead to simply maintaining it, keeping enough ammunition and fuel flowing to prevent German counterattacks from succeeding through Allied supply exhaustion rather than German strength. Cherbourg becomes the obsession, the natural port at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula that might solve the supply crisis if captured and repaired. The original Overlord plan anticipated capturing Cherbourg by D+8, June 14th. By June 21st, American forces are still fighting to take the port, facing determined German defenders who've been ordered to destroy the harbour facilities completely before surrendering. The Normandy campaign, planned as a rapid breakout, has become a grinding attritional battle, partly because the June storm destroyed the supply arrangements that were supposed to enable mobile operations. Every gallon of fuel becomes precious, every shell counted, every advance balanced against logistical sustainability. The German forces inland, also suffering from their own supply difficulties due to Allied air attacks on their logistics, don't realise how close the Allies come to crisis during the June storm. If German intelligence had understood that Allied supply capacity dropped to 25% of requirements for 4 days, that ammunition stocks were approaching exhaustion, a major counterattack during this window might have succeeded through Allied inability to sustain defensive fire. But the Germans are focused on their own problems. Panzer divisions scattered by air attacks, artillery ammunition rationed due to destroyed supply depots, fuel shortages, limiting vehicle movement. Both sides are trying to fight while starving logistically, and the advantage goes to whichever side can restore supply flow faster. By June 23rd, 4 days after it began, the storm finally subsides, leaving a beach landscape transformed. The wreckage is extraordinary. Hundreds of destroyed landing craft driven onto the sand, smashed vehicles, splintered whale pontoon sections, debris scattered for miles. The cleanup takes days, bulldozers pushing wreckage aside to clear landing zones, salvage teams attempting to recover usable equipment from destroyed craft. The supply flow resumes, slowly at first, accelerating as more landing craft are repaired or transferred from England. But the comfortable surplus that existed before the storm is gone, replaced by hand-to-mouth logistics where shortages in one category must be accepted to maintain adequacy in others. The British Mulberry B is restored to partial operation by early July and will eventually handle significant cargo volumes, validating Churchill's concept even though Mulberry A failed catastrophically. The American sector must make do with the damaged open beaches and the increasingly desperate push to capture Cherbourg, which finally falls on June 26th but requires weeks of repair before handling cargo, the Germans having demolished the port thoroughly. The harbour facilities are sabotaged with demolitions that destroy cranes, block basins with sunken ships, mine the approach channels, render the port essentially useless until American engineers can spend weeks clearing and rebuilding. It's not until late July, nearly 2 months after D-Day, that Cherbourg begins handling substantial cargo, and by then the critical period has passed. The June storm comes closer to defeating the Normandy invasion than any German counterattack. 4 days of weather accomplish what panzer divisions couldn't, cutting the Allied supply line, forcing rationing of ammunition and fuel, preventing the expansion of operations, buying time for German reinforcements to arrive and establish defensive lines. The invasion survives because the storm ends before supplies run completely out, because desperate measures like direct beaching of freighters provide just enough flow to sustain operations, and because German forces don't realise the opportunity the storm created. But the margin is terrifyingly thin, measured in days, of ammunition remaining in fuel sufficient for 1 more week of operations. The artificial harbours were supposed to protect against exactly this contingency, and one failed completely while the other barely survived. The lesson is brutal. In war, you can plan for everything and still be surprised by weather, by chaos, by the 1,000 things that can go wrong when you try to supply an army across open beaches in the world's most temperamental body of water. The storm that nearly won reveals how fragile the entire enterprise was, how dependent on good fortune, how close to disaster even apparent success can be. The invasion survives, but June 19th through 22nd, 1944, will be remembered in military logistics circles as the 4 days that almost lost the war through precipitation and wind. June 12th, 1944, 8 a.m. 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach. Private Robert Miller of the 29th Infantry Division crouches behind a hedgerow, staring at the next field over, trying to understand why 6 days of combat have moved his unit exactly 1 mile inland, when the plan called for 10. The field is perhaps 100 yards square, bounded on all sides by earthen banks 6 feet tall, topped with dense hedgerows another 4 feet high, roots penetrating deep into the soil, creating walls that are essentially natural fortifications. Somewhere in the far corner, a German machine gun team is positioned, invisible behind the vegetation, waiting for Americans to cross the open ground. Miller's platoon lost 4 men in the last field trying this exact approach. Run across open ground, get cut down by machine gun fire, the survivors pinned until artillery or tanks can suppress the position. Then advance to the next hedgerow, encounter another machine gun team, repeat the process, 100 yards per hour if you're lucky, 100 yards per day if you're not, and there are thousands of these fields between the beach and anything that matters. This is the Bocage, Norman hedgerow country, and it's turning the invasion into World War I trench warfare with slightly better drainage. The hedgerows were in every reconnaissance photo, visible from the air, dismissed by planners as agricultural features that wouldn't significantly impede military operations. This assessment proves catastrophically wrong in the first hours of fighting inland. The hedgerows are not decorative barriers, but fortifications built by centuries of Norman farmers, earthen banks reinforced by stone, topped with dense growth of hawthorn, oak, elm, ash, roots intertwining into wooden armour impenetrable to small arms fire. The banks themselves are products of field clearing, generations of farmers piling rocks and earth at field boundaries, creating elevated positions that provide perfect cover and concealment. The hedgerows run in every direction, dividing the landscape into thousands of tiny compartments, each one a potential battlefield, each one defensible by a handful of soldiers with a machine gun. The tactical problem becomes apparent in the first days of inland fighting. American infantry advancing from the beaches pushed through the first hedgerow lines easily, German coastal defences oriented toward the beaches rather than inland. But once past the immediate coastal zone, the advance hits the full bocage and slows to a crawl. Every field must be approached carefully. Reconnaissance to determine if it's defended, fire support to suppress potential positions, infantry assault across open ground while exposed to fire from elevated positions behind the far hedgerow. The defenders have every advantage: cover, concealment, elevated firing positions, pre-sighted fields of fire, the ability to retreat through gaps in the next hedgerow while attackers are still crossing open ground. One German machine gun team can hold up an entire American company for hours, inflicting casualties, consuming ammunition, delaying the advance until artillery or armour can be brought up. The tank problem makes everything worse. American Sherman tanks, essential for infantry support, become death traps in the bocage. The standard approach to a hedgerow is for the tank to climb the earthen bank, push through the vegetation, and drop into the next field. But climbing the bank exposes the tank's vulnerable belly armour, the thinnest part of the Sherman, to German anti-tank fire. Panzerfaust teams, infantry armed with single-shot anti-tank rockets, position themselves to hit climbing tanks from the side or below, penetrating the armour, killing crews in fireballs of ignited fuel and ammunition. Tank after tank is destroyed using this technique, and by mid-June, tank crews are refusing to climb hedgerows, staying in the lanes and roads where they're vulnerable to mines and ambush, but at least not exposing their belly armour. The infantry, needing tank support to suppress German positions, finds itself advancing without armour, taking higher casualties, slowing the advance even further. The casualty rates tell the story of bocage fighting. From June 7th through June 30th, 23 days, the American forces advancing from Omaha and Utah beaches gain approximately 20 miles against moderate German resistance, suffering 40,000 casualties in the process. That's approximately 1,700 casualties per mile of advance, 2,000 casualties per day, attrition rates, similar to the Western Front in World War I. The 29th Infantry Division, which landed on D-Day at full strength, loses over 3,000 men in the first 3 weeks, a casualty rate approaching 30%, requiring constant replacement of dead and wounded, with soldiers fresh from England who have no combat experience and minimal understanding of bocage tactics. The Germans are also suffering, but they're defending, requiring fewer men to hold positions than Americans need to attack, and they're learning to use the terrain even more effectively as the battle continues. The Saint-Lô offensive in early July demonstrates bocage warfare at its worst. Saint-Lô is a market town 7 miles inland from Omaha Beach, a communications hub controlling roads necessary for any advance toward Paris. The town sits on elevated ground overlooking the Vire River Valley, naturally defensible, fortified by German troops who understand its importance. The 19th Corps, including the 29th Infantry Division, is ordered to capture Saint-Lô by July 11th, an objective that seems reasonable until you factor in the bocage separating American positions from the town. The advance begins July 7th with artillery bombardment and infantry assault. 8 days later, on July 15th, American forces finally enter Saint-Lô, having advanced approximately 5 miles through some of the densest hedgerow country in Normandy. The cost is over 5,000 casualties for 5 miles. Over 1,000 casualties per mile, the 29th Division alone losing 3,000 men. Effectively combat ineffective, pulled from the line for rest and replacement. The innovation that finally provides a solution comes from a sergeant, not from generals or engineers. Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armoured Division, watching tanks get destroyed trying to climb hedgerows, begins experimenting with scrap metal from German beach obstacles, welding steel prongs to the front of Sherman tanks. The prongs act like teeth, cutting through the earthen bank and hedgerow roots, allowing tanks to push through without climbing and exposing belly armour. Cullen's design, dubbed the Rhino or Hedgerow Cutter, is crude but effective. Once tested and approved, ordnance units begin mass-producing the cutters, using steel from Belgian gates and Element C obstacles, cluttering the beaches. By late July, over 500 Sherman tanks are equipped with Rhino cutters, transforming the tactical situation. Tanks can now support infantry by punching through hedgerows directly, suppressing German positions from unexpected angles, reducing casualties and accelerating the advance rate. It's a perfect example of field innovation solving a problem that official planning never anticipated. The bocage also affects British forces in their sector, though to a lesser extent because the terrain east of Caen is more open, suitable for the armoured warfare that British doctrine emphasises. But west of Caen, where British forces attempt to link up with Americans, the hedgerows create the same problems. Slow advances, high casualties, every field a small battle. The British developed their own techniques, using Churchill Avery tanks equipped with petards, short-range mortars firing 40-pound explosive charges to blast gaps in hedgerows. They also employ more artillery than Americans, British doctrine favouring massive bombardments to suppress defensive positions before infantry advance. But even with heavier artillery support, British advances through bocage measure in hundreds of yards per day rather than miles. The German defenders, initially surprised by how effectively the bocage aids defence, quickly developed doctrine to exploit it. Small, squad-sized strongpoints in each field, machine gun teams, supported by riflemen, orders to hold until flanked or overwhelmed, then retreat to the next hedgerow and repeat. Anti-tank teams roam between fields, ambushing Allied armour, withdrawing before counterfire can locate them. Snipers use the elevation and concealment to pick off American officers, creating leadership casualties that slow decision-making and reduce unit cohesion. The Germans don't need to win battles, just delay, make every yard expensive, buy time for more reinforcements to arrive, and establish defensive lines further back. By late July, when the Saint-Lô offensive finally succeeds, and American forces have ground through the worst of the bocage, the attrition has transformed the invasion force. Divisions that landed on D-Day are shadows of their original strength, filled with replacements who haven't trained together, led by new officers, replacing casualties. Combat effectiveness is degraded, not through cowardice or lack of will, but through exhaustion, through the grinding attrition of bocage warfare where every field is a battle and every mile costs hundreds of casualties. The Germans have paid heavily too, but they've achieved their strategic objective, delaying the Allied breakout for nearly 2 months, giving time for the Falaise defensive line to be prepared, ensuring the Normandy campaign becomes an attrition battle rather than a rapid exploitation. The bocage is finally broken, not through brilliant tactics, but through accumulated superiority. More tanks with hedgerow cutters allowing combined arms tactics, more artillery providing suppressive fire, more air support striking German positions once weather clears, and the simple mathematics of replacement where Americans can afford 30% casualties and maintain strength through reinforcements, while German divisions are ground down without adequate replacements. But the breakthrough, when it finally comes in late July with Operation Cobra, happens only after the bocage has consumed 2 months and 40,000 American casualties, proving that terrain can be as deadly an enemy as any Wehrmacht division And that military planning that dismisses agricultural features as insignificant does so at the cost of the soldiers who must fight through those features with inadequate preparation and doctrine. The Bocage trap closes on both sides, but the Germans, defending, take fewer casualties. The Allies, attacking, pay the butcher's bill that Bocage warfare demands. The price is acceptable only because American industrial capacity can replace losses faster than German capacity, making this a war of attrition that America can sustain and Germany cannot. But sustainable attrition is still attrition. And the men dying in Norman fields don't care about strategic mathematics. June 7th, 1944, noon. British Second Army Headquarters, Normandy. General Miles Dempsey studies maps showing the advance from Sword, Juno and Gold beaches, noting with frustration that Caen, the D-Day objective meant to be captured on June 6th, remains firmly in German hands 18 hours after the invasion began. The British 3rd Infantry Division pushed to within 3 miles of the city before being stopped by elements of the 21st Panzer Division counterattacking from Caen. Now the front has stabilised, British forces holding a line north of the city, Germans defending Caen itself, neither side able to break the stalemate. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces, visits Dempsey's headquarters and delivers orders that sound like madness. Continue attacking Caen, draw German armour to this sector, pin them in place and hold them there, no matter the cost. Dempsey looks at the casualty reports, already over 2,000 British dead from D-Day, and understands what Montgomery is really ordering. Turn the British sector into the anvil against which German panzer divisions will smash themselves, accepting British casualties to enable American breakout elsewhere. It's strategically brilliant and personally horrifying. The original Overlord plan designated Caen as a D-Day objective, critical for its road network, rail connections, and open terrain beyond the city suitable for airfield construction. Capturing Caen quickly would allow British forces to push southeast toward the Seine, potentially trapping German forces in Normandy in a massive encirclement. But the plan assumed German resistance would collapse under overwhelming bombardment and airborne disruption. Instead, the Germans defend Caen with fanatical determination, recognizing it as the hinge of their defensive line, the position that, if lost, would allow British armour to break out into the French interior with potentially war-winning consequences. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, arrives in the Caen sector by June 8th and immediately counterattacks British positions north of the city, beginning a pattern that will define the next 2 months. British attacks, German counterattacks. Both sides bleeding each other in grinding attrition that transforms the Caen sector into the Eastern Front transplanted to Normandy. Operation Epsom, launched June 26th, demonstrates Montgomery's strategy and its costs. The British 8th Corps, including the 15th Scottish Division, attacks west of Caen, attempting to outflank the city from that direction, cross the Odon River, and seize high ground overlooking the German positions. The offensive begins with massive artillery bombardment, over 700 guns firing for hours, attempting to suppress German defences before infantry advance. But the Germans, learning from their Eastern Front experience, pull back during bombardments, occupy positions in depth rather than concentration on the front line, then counterattack when British forces advance into the bombardment zone. The result is a brutal 4-day battle in rain and mud, British forces advancing 3 miles at cost of 4,000 casualties, capturing the Odon crossing but unable to exploit because German panzer divisions counterattack immediately, pushing British forces back to defensible positions. The significance of Epsom isn't territorial gain, but German response. 5 SS Panzer divisions are committed to the Caen sector to stop this offensive. Armour that could otherwise reinforce the German positions opposite American forces west of Caen. Montgomery's strategy is working precisely as intended. British attacks are drawing German armour, holding it in place, preventing it from being used elsewhere. But the cost in British lives is staggering, and the public doesn't understand why Montgomery keeps attacking the strongest part of the German line rather than the weaker sectors. The British press begins criticising Montgomery as overcautious, unable to capture Caen despite overwhelming superiority, not understanding that the failure to capture Caen is intentional, part of a strategy to draw German strength away from where the real breakout will happen. Operation Charnwood, July 8th through 9th, attacks Caen directly after 6 weeks of failure to outflank it. The offensive begins with RAF heavy bomber attack on the northern districts of Caen, over 460 aircraft, dropping thousands of bombs on a city that's already suffered through weeks of artillery fire. The bombing is devastating but largely counterproductive. It destroys much of the medieval city, kills over 3,000 French civilians, and creates rubble that blocks the streets, making armoured advance impossible. British infantry enter the northern districts on July 9th, fighting street to street, building to building. German defenders using the rubble created by Allied bombing as fortifications. By July 10th, British forces control northern Caen, but the Germans hold the southern districts across the Orne River, meaning Caen is partially captured but not secured, the battle continuing with the city as the prize. The casualty reports from the Caen fighting reveal the strategic trade-off Montgomery has accepted. From June 7th through July 10th, British and Canadian forces suffer approximately 37,000 casualties, killed and wounded, in continuous attacks around Caen. For comparison, American forces in the same period suffer 40,000 casualties, but are fighting across the entire western sector, including the Bocage. The British casualties are concentrated in a smaller area, focused on Caen, producing casualty densities that rival the worst battles of the First World War. The British Second Army is being ground down through continuous combat, divisions pulled from the line at 30 to 40% casualties, rest and refitting required before they can attack again, the tempo of operations maintained only through constant rotation and reinforcement. The German perspective on Caen reveals why Montgomery's strategy succeeds despite apparent failure. The Germans commit 7 panzer divisions to the Caen sector by mid-July. 12th SS Panzer, Panzerlehr, 1st SS Panzer, 2nd Panzer, 21st Panzer, 9th SS Panzer, 10th SS Panzer. That's approximately 645 tanks concentrated against British forces, armour that doctrine says should be held in reserve for counterattacks against any breakthrough, instead committed to stopping continuous British offensives that never quite break through but never quite stop either. By contrast, German forces facing Americans in the western sector have approximately 190 tanks, less than one-third the armour facing the British. The force ratio created by Montgomery's strategy is the opposite of what German doctrine requires. They're defending against the stronger Allied force with their strongest units, while defending against the weaker Allied force with weaker units. It's strategically insane, but forced by the operational reality that British attacks must be stopped or Caen falls and the entire defensive line collapses. Operation Goodwood, July 18th through 20th, represents the climax of the Caen fighting and the ultimate demonstration of Montgomery's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties to achieve strategic objectives. The operation commits 3 British armoured divisions, over 700 tanks, to attack southeast of Caen, attempting to break through German lines and reach the open country beyond. It's the largest British armoured offensive of the war, and it opens with the largest single-day bombing mission. RAF heavy bombers dropping over 7,000 tons on German positions in a 5 square mile area, attempting to destroy defences before the armour attacks. The bombing is spectacularly destructive, creating a landscape that resembles the moon. But the Germans, now experienced with Allied bombing tactics, have pulled their armour back beyond the bombardment zone, occupy positions in depth, and wait for the British tanks to advance into their kill zones. The British armour advances at 7:30 a.m. on July 18th, rolling through the devastated bombardment area, believing they're attacking shattered defences. Instead, they emerge into a 3-mile-deep anti-tank belt that the Germans have prepared carefully. 88mm guns positioned in depth, Panthers and Tigers waiting in hull-down positions on high ground, infantry with Panzerfausts covering approaches. The British tanks advance into this killing ground and are destroyed systematically, knocked out by fire from positions they can't see, trapped in lanes between minefields where they can't manoeuvre, picked off by German gunners who've been waiting for exactly this target-rich environment. By the end of July 18th, the British have lost over 200 tanks, the single worst day for British armour in the entire war. The offensive continues July 19th and 20th, losing another 200 tanks, penetrating 6 miles but unable to break through, finally ending with over 400 British tanks destroyed and 5,500 casualties for minimal territorial gain. The reaction to Goodwood reveals the fundamental misunderstanding of Montgomery's strategy. The American press criticizes it as a failure, questions why Montgomery can't capture Kane after 6 weeks, suggests he should be replaced by a more aggressive commander. Some American generals, including Patton, who's waiting to enter the battle, view Goodwood's casualty rates as evidence of British military incompetence. But from Montgomery's perspective, Goodwood succeeds strategically even, while failing tactically. The operation draws more German armour to the Kane sector, fixes them in place, ensures they're not available to counterattack American forces preparing for Operation Cobra in the western sector. The 400 tanks lost at Goodwood are acceptable casualties if they enable American breakthrough elsewhere, because tank losses can be replaced while operational opportunities cannot. The German response to the Kane fighting validates Montgomery's assessment. By late July, having committed 7 panzer divisions to stopping British attacks, the Germans have effectively tied up their strategic reserve in a defensive battle, where their mobility and training advantages are neutralised by British firepower and attrition. The panzers can't be withdrawn from Caen without risking immediate British breakthrough, but keeping them there means they're unavailable elsewhere. When American forces finally break through in Operation Cobra on July 25th, the Germans have insufficient armour to counterattack effectively, because it's all engaged at Caen. The strategic paralysis Montgomery created by continuous pressure on the Caen sector achieves exactly what Overlord planning intended: hold German armour in place while the decisive operation happens elsewhere. By August 9th, when Caen is finally secured completely, the British and Canadian forces have suffered over 60,000 casualties in 9 weeks of continuous fighting focused on one city and its surrounding territory. The casualty rate approaches 40% for some divisions. The entire British Second Army rotated through combat, rest, and return multiple times. The strategic achievement is undeniable. The German army in Normandy is being destroyed. Its armour committed piecemeal to defensive battles. Its infantry ground down through attrition. Its ability to conduct mobile warfare eliminated by being forced to defend fixed positions. But the human cost is equally undeniable. Thousands of British and Canadian soldiers dead, tens of thousands wounded, families receiving telegrams about casualties suffered in attacks that seemed to fail, press reporting stalemate and questioning strategy, public wondering why victory requires such sacrifice. Montgomery's anvil strategy works, but anvils are hard and unforgiving, and the British troops fighting around Caen are being hammered between that anvil and the German panzers, with costs that will haunt British military planning for decades. The Caen anvil holds, the German army smashes itself against it. The breakout happens elsewhere, which was the point all along. But the men who died holding the anvil don't get to see the vindication of the strategy that killed them. July 24th, 1944, 1 p.m, Saint-Lô, France. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer in the European theatre, stands in an observation post overlooking the sector where Operation Cobra will launch tomorrow, the offensive meant to break through German lines and enable Third Army's exploitation into open country. McNair is 61 years old, a staff officer throughout his career, never commanded troops in combat, but today he's visiting frontline units to understand the battle firsthand. Above him, American heavy bombers are conducting a preliminary strike, softening German positions before tomorrow's main attack. The bombardment is supposed to land on German lines 1,500 yards south of American positions, safe separation to prevent friendly fire. But bomb aiming from 15,000 feet is imprecise, and some bombers release early. McNair hears the whistling, distinctive sound of falling bombs, realizes they're short, falling on American positions. The blast kills him instantly, makes him the highest-ranking American officer killed by friendly fire in the entire war. Operation Cobra begins with an omen written in the death of generals and the bodies of soldiers killed by their own air force. The planning for Cobra attempts to solve the fundamental problem that's plagued the Normandy campaign since D-Day: how to break through prepared German defences without suffering Bocage-level attrition. The solution is overwhelming firepower concentration, saturate a narrow 6-square-mile area with bombs and artillery, destroy everything in that zone, then push armour through before Germans can recover. The bombing plan is unprecedented. 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers will drop over 4,000 tons of ordnance on German positions west of Saint-Lô. The bombardment will last 90 minutes, creating a rolling barrage of destruction moving south ahead of advancing American forces. Following the bombing, 2,700 artillery pieces will fire for 30 minutes, adding high explosive and white phosphorus shells to the devastation. Then the 1st Infantry Division and 9th Infantry Division, supported by 2 armoured divisions, will attack through the bombardment corridor, exploit the breakthrough, and allow Patton's 3rd Army to pass through and begin the exploitation phase. July 25th, 9 a.m. The bombing begins, and immediately the short bombing problem from the day before repeats on a massive scale. Bombers approaching from the north are supposed to fly parallel to American lines, dropping perpendicular to the front to minimise the chance of shorts landing on friendly positions. But the Air Force, overruling ground commanders, routes the bombers perpendicular to the lines, flying over American positions to reach German targets, guaranteeing that any short drops will hit friendly forces. The bombardment is spectacular, creating a landscape of fire and destruction, German positions disappearing under explosions, dust and smoke rising thousands of feet. But bombs are falling short across the entire frontage, landing on American positions that are supposed to be safe. The 30th Infantry Division, positioned nearest the bombardment line, takes the worst casualties, 111 killed, 621 wounded by American bombs. Among the dead is Lieutenant General McNair, his body found in a crater, identified through personal effects, given a closed casket funeral because there's not enough left for open casket. The friendly fire casualties create immediate crisis. The divisions that are supposed to lead the attack have just been bombed by their own Air Force. Unit cohesion is disrupted, morale is shattered, soldiers are screaming at the sky, asking why their own planes are killing them. General Bradley, commanding 1st Army, receives the casualty reports and faces a terrible decision. Cancel the offensive and acknowledge that friendly fire has destroyed the attack before it began, or proceed despite the casualties, accepting that some units are combat ineffective but hoping others can still execute the plan. Bradley decides to continue, not because it's humane, but because pausing gives Germans time to recover, and the only thing worse than attacking after being bombed by your own Air Force is waiting while Germans reinforce positions that the bombing should have destroyed. The German defences in the Cobra sector are held by Panzer Division, which entered Normandy in mid-June as one of the best-equipped armoured divisions in the Wehrmacht and has since been ground down through continuous combat and air attacks. By July 25th, Panzer has perhaps 40 operational tanks remaining from its original 183, its infantry reduced to 50% strength, its artillery depleted through attrition. But the division still occupies strong defensive positions, and its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, has positioned his units in depth rather than concentration on the front line, learning from experience that American attacks always feature massive bombardment, followed by infantry advance. The bombing on July 25th devastates Panzer forward positions, but units positioned deeper survive, disoriented and suppressed but not destroyed, capable of resisting when American forces attack. The American attack begins at 11 a.m., 1st and 9th Infantry Divisions advancing through the bombardment zone expecting minimal resistance. Instead, they encounter German troops emerging from dugouts and basements, setting up machine guns, firing from positions that should have been obliterated. The advance is slower than expected, taking casualties, grinding forward through rubble and craters created by the bombing that actually impede American movement as much as help. By evening of July 25th, the advance has penetrated only 3 miles, well short of objectives, and German defensive lines are still intact. Bradley goes to sleep that night convinced Cobra has failed, that another offensive has become another Bocage attrition battle. That breakthrough remains impossible. July 26th changes everything. The follow-up attacks on the second day of Cobra penetrate German lines that spent July 25th absorbing punishment but are now cracking under sustained pressure. Panzer Division, already at 50% strength before Cobra began, suffers 70% casualties in 2 days and effectively ceases to exist as a fighting formation. German defensive positions are abandoned as units, retreat or surrender, unable to hold without support, outflanked by American units, exploiting gaps that suddenly appear in what was solid defensive line. By afternoon of July 26th, the breakthrough Bradley thought was failing has succeeded. American armour is advancing through German rear areas, encountering minimal resistance. The front is collapsing into rout. July 27th through 31st transforms the breakthrough into exploitation. Combat Command B of the 1st Armoured Division advances 30 miles in 2 days, faster than any American unit has moved since landing in Normandy. bypassing German strongpoints, racing toward Avranches, the town controlling access to Brittany and the open country of western France. The Germans attempt to establish defensive lines, but American mobility and air superiority prevent any coordinated defense from forming. Units retreating from Cobra are strafed by fighter bombers, command posts are destroyed by airstrikes, supply columns are annihilated on the roads, creating chaos that spreads faster than orders can restore control. August 1st, 1944. Third Army officially activates under Lieutenant General George Patton, who has been waiting since D-Day to enter combat. His role in Fortitude Deception complete, his fictional command of the Phantom 1st US Army Group no longer needed. Patton takes command of the exploitation, directing armoured divisions through the Avranches Gap, pushing into Brittany, racing east toward the Seine, creating the wide-ranging mobile warfare that is his specialty. Third Army advances 200 miles in 2 weeks, a pace that makes Bocage fighting seem from another war, liberating towns whose names become celebrated: Mayenne, Le Mans, Orléans, covering ground that First Army took weeks to capture in days. Because German defensive coherence has collapsed, and exploitation is fundamentally different from breakthrough fighting. The friendly fire casualties that began Cobra are acknowledged but minimized in after-action reports, downplayed to avoid damaging Air Force-Army relations, rationalized as acceptable losses given the operational success. 136 American dead, 621 wounded from short bombing on July 25th, is presented as unfortunate but unavoidable, the price of employing overwhelming firepower, worth the cost, given that Cobra finally broke through where 6 weeks of Bocage fighting could not. The families who receive telegrams about sons or husbands killed by American bombs are not told the details. Death certificates list killed in action without specifying who did the killing, maintaining morale and avoiding questions about whether American air power is more danger to its own troops than to Germans. The strategic success of Cobra is undeniable. By August 10th, American forces have broken through German lines, exploited into open country, threatened to encircle German forces in Normandy, forced a strategic crisis that will lead to the Falaise pocket and effective destruction of German Army Group B. The breakthrough that planners thought might take months happens in 2 weeks once German defences crack, validating the concept that concentrated firepower can shatter prepared defences if applied with sufficient weight. But the human cost lingers. Friendly fire casualties, the death of McNair, the units that absorbed casualties before the attack even began, all testimony that even successful operations extract prices beyond enemy action. Cobra succeeds because it accepts risks that previous operations avoided. Concentrated bombing despite friendly fire danger, immediate exploitation without pausing to consolidate, armoured advances beyond infantry support, accepting vulnerability to counterattacks that never materialise. The operation works because German defensive capacity is finally exhausted, Panzerlehr destroyed, other divisions reduced through continuous combat, reserves committed to the Caen sector, unavailable to contain breakthrough in the west. The timing is everything. Cobra launched 2 weeks earlier, fails against stronger defences, launched 2 weeks later, happens after Germans establish new defensive lines. The window exists in late July because Montgomery's strategy has succeeded in drawing German armour east while wearing down German infantry west. The anvil held at Caen, and the hammer strikes at Saint-Lô with force that shatters German defences precisely because they're weaker here than elsewhere. The breakthrough comes with its own mythology. Patton racing across France, the war becoming mobile, victory seeming inevitable. But the breakthrough was built on 8 weeks of attrition that consumed 60,000 Allied casualties, preparing conditions where concentrated attack could succeed. The Cobra strikes suddenly, but the snake was coiled through months of preparation, and the strike is lethal only because everything before made it possible. August 25th, 1944. Paris. General Jacques Leclerc's French 2nd Armoured Division enters the city that has been occupied for 4 years. Liberated through a combination of resistance uprising and Allied advance, restored to French sovereignty through careful political orchestration that allows de Gaulle to claim credit for liberation achieved by American logistics and British strategy. Church bells ring across the city, Parisians fill the streets in celebrations that will be photographed and filmed and remembered as the moment when Fortress Europe truly fell. Eisenhower arrives the next day, walks the Champs-Élysées in a ceremony designed to validate Allied commitment to French liberation. The newsreels show triumph, the photographs capture joy, and the liberation of Paris becomes the symbolic victory that justifies the Overlord campaign. But Paris is a symbol, not a strategic objective. The real measure of Overlord's success is grimmer, measured in destroyed German divisions, in casualties inflicted and sustained, in territory captured at costs that would be unthinkable in modern warfare. The Falaise pocket, forming in mid-August and closing on August 21st, represents the operational culmination of the Normandy campaign and reveals both its success and its limitations. As American forces race east from the Cobra breakthrough and British and Canadian forces push south from Caen, they create a pocket around Falaise, where approximately 100,000 German troops are trapped, surrounded by Allied forces, subject to continuous artillery and air attack. The pocket should be a complete encirclement, a canny-level destruction of German Army Group B, but coordination failures between American and Canadian forces leave a gap at Chambois through which perhaps 20,000 to 40,000 Germans escape between August 17th and 20th. The Germans who don't escape are killed or captured. Approximately 10,000 dead in the pocket, 50,000 captured, hundreds of tanks and vehicles destroyed. But the 40,000 who escape reform east of the Seine reconstitute units that will fight at the German border, meaning Overlord destroys German forces in Normandy but doesn't eliminate them completely. The casualty accounting for the Normandy campaign from D-Day through the Seine crossing reveals the human cost of liberation. American forces suffer 125,847 casualties, including 20,838 dead, representing approximately 29% casualty rate. British forces suffer 83,045 casualties, including 15,995 dead, 21% casualty rate. Canadian forces suffer 18,444 casualties, including 5,021 dead, 18% casualty rate. The total Allied casualties are 227,336, approximately 11% of the total Allied forces deployed. These numbers are sustainable for industrial democracies, with population reserves and replacement systems, but they represent individual tragedies. Men who died on beaches, in hedgerows, in destroyed tanks, in friendly fire incidents, their bodies buried in temporary cemeteries that will become permanent memorials at places like Colleville-sur-Mer above Omaha Beach. German casualties are harder to quantify because German record-keeping collapsed in the final weeks of the Normandy campaign, but estimates suggest approximately 200,000 killed or wounded and 200,000 captured, meaning German Army Group B suffered approximately 80% casualties. These casualties are not sustainable for Germany in summer 1944 when the Eastern Front is consuming divisions even faster and industrial capacity cannot replace losses. The German divisions that retreat from Normandy are shadows of their former strength, often reduced to 20 to 30% of authorised personnel, lacking vehicles and heavy weapons, incapable of sustained operations without rest and refitting that German logistics cannot provide. The material balance is equally stark. Allied forces land approximately 2 million men, 438,000 vehicles, and 3 million tons of supplies during the Normandy campaign, demonstrating logistical capacity that Germany cannot match. The supply flow, disrupted by the June storm but never completely stopped, averages approximately 30,000 tons daily by late August, sufficient to sustain operations and build reserves for operations beyond the Seine. German logistics, by contrast, collapses under Allied air interdiction, units rationing ammunition and fuel, unable to conduct mobile operations even when doctrine requires them. The material advantage that Allied planning always assumed would be decisive proves exactly that. German tactical excellence and defensive skill delay but cannot prevent defeat when fighting an enemy that can replace every loss and sustain every casualty. The liberation speed after Falaise surprises even Allied planners. Paris falls August 25th, Brussels September 3rd, Antwerp September 4th, Luxembourg September 10th. Achievements that seem to validate the most optimistic Overlord projections, but this rapid advance creates its own problems. Supply lines stretch to breaking units racing ahead of their logistics, the famous Red Ball Express truck convoys running 24 hours daily to deliver fuel and ammunition to armies that have outrun their supply bases. By September, Allied forces are approaching the German border, but are stopped less by German resistance than by lack of fuel, ammunition shortages, the inevitable pause that happens when armies advance faster than logistics can sustain. The Mulberry Bee Harbour at Arromanches continues operating through November 1944, handling significant cargo volumes, validating Churchill's concept even though Mulberry A was destroyed. But by autumn, the majority of Allied supplies come through Cherbourg, captured June 26th, but not fully operational until late July, eventually handling cargo volumes that make it one of the busiest ports in the world. The artificial harbour was necessary for the critical June and July period when Cherbourg was unavailable, bridged the supply gap that could have strangled the invasion, demonstrated that engineering ambition can solve problems that seem impossible if enough resources are committed. The strategic impact of Overlord on the wider war is immediate and decisive. The second front that Stalin demanded since 1941 finally exists, forcing Germany to defend against two major offensives simultaneously, east and west, splitting resources that might have stopped one if concentrated. The liberation of France removes German access to Atlantic ports, eliminates the submarine bases that threatened Allied shipping, restores French industrial capacity to Allied side. The psychological impact of Overlord's success convinces neutral nations that Allied victory is inevitable, accelerates the collapse of German alliances, isolates Hitler diplomatically as well as militarily. The war in Europe will continue 9 more months. But the outcome is essentially decided in Normandy between June and August 1944. The memorials to Overlord are immediate and permanent. The American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer above Omaha Beach contains 9,387 graves. The British and Canadian cemeteries in Normandy, another 17,769. These numbers don't include the missing. The men whose bodies were never recovered from the Channel or buried in unmarked graves or destroyed so completely that identification was impossible. The families who received telegrams through summer and autumn 1944 learned their sons or husbands or fathers died in the liberation of Europe, a phrase meant to provide meaning to loss but offering limited comfort to parents who will never see their children again. The question that haunts Overlord retrospectives is whether modern forces could execute a similar operation. The acceptable casualty rates of 1944, 10 to 30% casualties considered sustainable, would end military careers and governments today. The friendly fire incidents, Exercise Tiger, the short bombing at Cobra would trigger investigations and reforms that might prevent the operations from continuing. The attrition warfare of the Bocage and Caen, measuring advances in hundreds of yards purchased with thousands of casualties, violates modern doctrine emphasizing maneuver and precision, yet Overlord succeeded precisely through accepting risks and costs that modern militaries consider unacceptable, through committing overwhelming force despite inefficiencies, through sustaining operations despite setbacks that might cause modern operations to pause for reassessment. The veterans who survived Normandy carry memories that are both heroic and horrible. The fear approaching the beaches, the chaos of landing under fire, the deaths of friends, the exhaustion of continuous combat, the gradual realization that they're winning despite the costs. Many will not talk about their experiences for decades, processing trauma privately, rejecting the hero narrative that doesn't match their memories of confusion and terror. Others will embrace the veteran identity, join reunions, return to Normandy beaches decades later to remember and honour those who didn't return. All carry the knowledge that they participated in something historically significant, that Overlord was not merely a battle but the beginning of liberation, that their service mattered even when the costs seemed unbearable. The final assessment of Operation Overlord must acknowledge both triumph and tragedy. The operation succeeded in its strategic objective, establishing the Second Front, liberating Western Europe, contributing decisively to Nazi Germany's defeat. But success came at costs that should never be minimised. Over 227,000 Allied casualties, 9,000 German civilians killed in preparatory bombing and combat, French towns and villages destroyed in the fighting, a generation of soldiers bearing physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The operation demonstrated what industrial democracies can achieve when unified by common purpose, when accepting that victory requires sacrifice, when committing total resources to total war. But it also demonstrated that even just wars extract unjust prices, that even necessary operations kill the innocent, that even victory is purchased with currency that can never be repaid. The beaches of Normandy today are peaceful, the bunkers silent, the obstacles removed, the blood washed away by 80 years of tides. But the cemeteries remain, 9,000 graves on the bluff above Omaha, more thousands across the Norman countryside, testament to the price of liberation. The men buried there, most in their 20s, never saw the world they died to create, never knew if their sacrifice mattered, never learned that Overlord succeeded and that their deaths contributed to that success. They died believing in a cause larger than themselves, trusting that their leaders had planned adequately, hoping that their courage would be sufficient. On June 6, 1944, all those beliefs and hopes were tested in blood and fire, and enough survived that we remember the day as victory rather than catastrophe. But the margin was thinner than the triumphant narratives suggest, the outcome less certain than hindsight implies, the success more dependent on fortune and enemy mistakes than planning perfection. Overlord succeeded because it was big enough to absorb catastrophic failures at Omaha, flexible enough to exploit unexpected successes at Utah, sustained enough to endure the June storm that destroyed Mulberry A, and executed by soldiers courageous enough to keep advancing despite losses that should have broken armies. The complete history is not a story of perfect planning rewarded with clean victory. It's the story of imperfect humans achieving extraordinary things through courage, sacrifice, and refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. That makes it more remarkable, not less. The promise made at Casablanca was kept. The price was everything those young men in the cemeteries could give. The victory they purchased endures. That must be enough, because it's all we have and all they left us.